Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Monday, May 5th joint City Council and Planning Commission work session. It is a work session, which means, although it's open to the public, there typically is not comment from the public, so you're free to observe, but generally not to speak. There will be regular hearings that you will have an opportunity to speak at later on. Anyway, welcome, though. Thank you all for coming out. Mr. Shields, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council, members of the Planning Commission. We do have a full agenda tonight, and we've only budgeted 15 minutes for a report from the Process Planning Committee, and we're starting 5 minutes late. And so I will be very brief, just in an overview, and I know that the members of the committee will probably want to chime in on some of the highlights of the work of this committee. We've met 7 times since, I think 8 times now actually, since the council commissioned this group to lay out a roadmap for doing the very important school planning and economic development planning on the George Mason Mary Ellen Henderson School campus. And we have Chairman Ruth Rogers is on the group, Dave Snyder, Dave Tarter, Chair Carney, John Lawrence, and Mike Novotny, supported by staff. And we've met at 7:30 a.m. each time. And had very good discussions about this important process. A lot of very smart people in the room, but the group has respected the council's wish that we not charge off and start to plan this site, but instead lay out the process by which we will engage with the community and a public decision-making process for the future of this site, to lay out the best configuration of the school, what the school's program needs are, where the school actually should be located. Economic development, what the best kinds and types of uses of economic development we'll look for on this site, where that economic development should best be located on the site. And really talking about how we can address those issues in an open and transparent and effective manner. So what's before the council for your feedback and just initial comments that we'll then incorporate and convey back to the committee so they can finish this draft and then provide a final report and then kick this work off. We laid out the charter for the group, some descriptions of the site and the purpose of the roadmap. We laid out 4 main steps in the process, and the first is to address some immediate issues, and then move into the community visioning process, then move into implementation, and then ultimately to move into construction, both of the school and then ultimately for the economic development portion of it as well. Some of the immediate issues that were identified, we need to address our staffing needs. Right now, we don't have this properly resourced and properly staffed. And the budget that the council just adopted, $250,000 is budgeted in the CIP to provide staffing and consulting resources to support this effort. So that feeds into issue number 2, what type of consulting services we'll need for this planning process. We also were successful in applying for and receiving an Urban Land Institute Technical Advisory Panel, the ULI TAP. We anticipate that we'll do that in the fall, and that will be a great resource for us in the planning effort. We've identified the need for a steering committee, and we recommend to the council and to the school board that the group that was constituted to form this roadmap be rechartered and reauthorized to be a steering committee over the coming 2 years to oversee this process. Not to do, again, the planning, but to help coordinate the major decisions and all the people who need to feed into those major decisions and make the trains run on time. Issue 4, engaging with neighbors. We've already begun that. We've met with Supervisor Faust. We've met with representatives of UVA and Virginia Tech. We've had staff level engagement with WMATA. Those are some of our key, ultimately, partners in this effort. And issue number 5, and this is one that I think probably will need some discussion. Currently, the land has no zoning on it with the boundary adjustment. And so we have proposed a very sort of narrow gauge zoning for the site that would just address basically the status quo, but also set the stage by rezoning process where the ultimate master plan could be adopted. But that's a point that the committee is not yet in full agreement on in terms of how we would effectively message to the community that this rezoning process for the school site is not the big process. This is just really a piece of housekeeping that we need to do quickly because the land currently has no zoning under it, and it does need some zoning and a future land use designation. Next, moving into the community vision, we describe the process for creating a vision for the schools and for economic development. And then that vision then folds into a master planning where we provide more detail. We also identify in the master plan process how much detail, particularly for the economic development portion of it, how prescriptive do we want to be for the market. So we haven't fully addressed that issue. We've laid it out there as an issue that needs to be decided. We need to build a financial model so we can assess the cost of the school, the return on economic development options, so that those two sync together with an overall feasibility to the financial plan. And as we get into implementation and construction, those second two phases were broader in our descriptions in this roadmap. We lay out some of the decisions that will need to be made and are less detailed in how we address them. But the implementation plan will need to address school financing, commercial development, the decision on whether to sell or lease the land that we'd use for economic development, and also the laying out of a schedule. Issue number 2, ultimately the selection of developers for the commercial development, when and if to issue a request for qualifications as a first step, just to bring in, I think, the core group of people who would participate in that process as a prelude to issuing an RFP, ultimately for the sale or lease of the land for the economic development. And then possibly concurrently or at an earlier step in the process, the selection of a process for school construction. And that could be either a big all-inclusive RFP where we have the economic development and the school construction linked together in a contract. That's very complex. We've gotten some feedback on that in terms of the complexity of that, but that's an option that we'll need to continue to discuss, or whether we proceed in a more traditional manner to bid out and construct the school on its own and then have the economic development proceed at its own pace in order to capture the best long-term market returns for that property. And then lastly, when we move into the construction part of the roadmap, that's where we just lay out some of the basic issues that we would need to address and recognize that in the development of the implementation plan, that's when we'll really make the decisions and lay out the framework for how the construction would proceed. So that's an overview of the roadmap that has been put down on paper, and would be happy to pause here and answer any questions on it. Jim Snyder or Rick Goff, we can also address any questions. And I'll just note in closing that and Jim's staff, Garrison Kitt, was the principal author of this document, and I think was very responsive to the input from the committee throughout the process to try to have a product that is legible, not too long, not overly prescriptive, but lay out the big steps that we need to take and the big decisions that need to be made.
Before we take any questions, if there are any, Vice Mayor Snyder, do you have any comments? Chairwoman Rogers, do you have any comments as a member of the committee?
No, only that I think we should emphasize that the timeline, 2015, 2016, is still flexible.
Good point. Are there any questions? If none, it was just really an update. Yes, please, of course.
I was just looking at, all of the planning, and I have to commend the board for a good, job, well done. But one of the things that struck me was that there was no discussion of long-term life cycle maintenance cost for this project. So we will build a school, but there's no plan to maintain the school in the long term, which I thought was disturbing, because I think when you're doing a project like this, it does require you to have a plan of action as to how you're going to maintain it for the future. So I think it's worth including that in the planning stages as well.
Thank you. Any other,
Yeah,
sure.
just one question. How was any opportunity for cooperation with Virginia Tech handled as far as their land, perhaps a common parking garage or structure or something like that?
Well, I think those things are all
But you-
ideas that are being
But they
considered.
have been talking, this
We've
group
just started-
has been talking to Virginia Tech.
We've started the process. We've
Okay.
just, that's the earliest stages.
Okay,
But
I was
those are
just
good
wondering
ideas.
if there had been conversation with them.
We've started that process. It's kind of at the earliest stages. There's more conversations to occur, I think, in the near future. But those are good ideas, and they'll be considered. Any other, yes, Ms. Oliver?
I just wonder if the final report could include some sort of pictorial representation of the flow of activities. Are they sequential? Are they some of them in parallel? I like pictures, and I think that pictures also help other people understand the process. And if we could just come up with something to help people visualize the different steps.
We've thought about that, and we've had a couple of iterations of that, but we haven't quite gotten it right yet. So in the final report, we do intend to have that sort of the one-pager that helps tell the story very quickly and effectively, so people don't have to read through the 10-page document.
Okay, unless there are any other comments, why don't we move on to the next item?
Okay. And council, I'll just, by introduction, Paul Stoddard is going to present give us a status report on the development of the Mobility for All Modes chapter of the comprehensive plan. In the council's retreat that back in February, the council did identify making the city a walkable and transit-oriented community, one of its top priorities. And this planning document will be, I think, one of the great organizing tools that we'll have to marshal our resources to make that vision become a reality. And so, Paul, take it away.
Will do. Thank you, Mayor Carter, members of the Planning Commission. So I have 15 minutes, so I'm going to run through the slides fairly quickly in the beginning, slow down at the end, I think the public engagement process, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes left over at the end for questions. So setting up what I'm going to talk about quickly in the rest of the presentation, motivation. Why do we want to update the city's comprehensive plan, specifically the transportation chapter?
Could you please talk into the mic?
Oh, sure. Second thing, in terms of impacts, what does it mean to update the transportation chapter? Third, content. I won't have much time for this, but what's in the draft chapter right now? And then lastly, what was the public engagement process that we went through to get to this stage? So motivation. The chapter was last updated significantly in 2005. So it's time to explore investment priorities. We have rising regional population, growing from 6.5 million in 2010 to 8.1 million in 2030 across the DC region. Means you're going to see, with that increase in population, you're going to see an increase in demand for travel. How do we want to accommodate that? Growing concern about traffic and parking. We've had a lot of requests for traffic calming come in 2013. We're already seeing some in 2014. And that goes along with shifting travel preferences in the city. Not everyone in the city is looking for this, but there is a vocal group out there that's looking for increases in pedestrian and bicycle facilities, and I'll be able to show you just how vocal at the end of the slides. Impacts, updating the comprehensive plan. The plan is a policy guide for development in the city, speaks to different forms of development, land use, natural resources, community facilities. It's used in the city's budgeting process to identify key infrastructure projects, also prioritizes projects and policies that the city wants to update. Impacts of using the chapter. The chapter is intended to be a work in progress, a living document of the city's progress against achieving these goals for a multimodal future. And it's also intended to be used as a tracking sheet, so set up a list of priorities the city wants to address, and then check off as those are done, a way to keep status of what's been achieved. Content, what's in the draft chapter right now, sets up the context for planning, which I talked about briefly, changes in preferences, increasing population, employment. It moves into vision and goals. Where does the city want to be with its transportation network? And what are the goals that go into that? And then breaking down transportation into 4 different component modes: pedestrian, bicycle, transit, automobile. And for each of those modes, what policy actions does the city need to undergo, and what infrastructure projects does the city need to implement? So context, as I mentioned, growing regional population and employment. And one thing to note on this slide is that the City of Falls Church between 2010 and 2030 is expected to grow pretty substantially from 12,000 residents to 16,000 residents. But realize that even if the City of Falls Church didn't grow at all, Tyson's Corner right next to us is expecting a pretty substantial employment and population growth. So even if the city holds constant, there's still going to be an increasing demand for travel to, from, and through the city as the areas around the city develop. And so you're always going to have some way of accommodating that increasing demand for travel. Vision and goals. The idea is to avoid something like this because we've heard that people don't like it, and instead aim for something like this, which is something that people do like. So how can we avoid this and mimic this to the extent that we can? That brings us to a vision statement, which I will go ahead and read out. Provide for the safe movement of people and goods within and through the city via a transportation network that connects to the regional transportation network, offers choices in travel modes, supports economic activity, is sensitive to the environment, provides equitable access for all city residents, workers, and visitors. That breaks down to a number of goals: safety, mode choice, economic, environmental activity, neighborhood character. People come to the city because they like it. And so we want to the extent that we can with the transportation network, maintain that quality of the environment. Equitable access. Make sure everyone has the ability to travel about the city. And then maintain the city's infrastructure. Pedestrian actions. So we're looking at a few things here, things like pedestrian-friendly standards. See an example of those here at the recently completed Pearson Square with things like bulb outs, nice textures in the pavements. It's easily distinguishable that this is a safe pedestrian environment. Developing a pedestrian facilities program and an ADA transition plan. Putting out pedestrian wayfinding. Let people know where things are in the city so that they can find their way around. And eventually earning recognition as a walk-friendly community. So just like the city has earned recognition as a Tree City USA, there are other things that the city can earn. Recognition as walk-friendly and, as I'll show later, bike-friendly. These are national standards that people recognize, and they use that when they're choosing a community to live in. Pedestrian projects. This isn't intended to be an implementation plan, but because of state code, we are required to put specific projects that we want to implement into the comprehensive plan, and so that's what we're doing here. Increased intersection safety at a couple streets along West Broad Street, implementing projects in the small area plan, focusing on corridor accessibility, and then looking at great streets projects. So how can we continue what's already been done along Broad Street and continue that along the entire street, as well as extend it to sections on Maple, as well as Park Avenue. Bicycle actions. There was a lot of talk about getting a bicycle facilities plan. I'll show the importance of that in the next slide. Looking into capital bike share. Some people really want it. Some people are really worried about the cost. So the place to start is with a feasibility study. Figure out how many people are going to use it. What's it going to cost? Is it worth it? Request to RAC, ways to increase bicycle parking throughout the city. Bicycle parking requirements. Right now we require automobile parking when a development goes up, but we don't require bike parking. Is that something we want to address? And then again, like for walk-friendly communities, earn recognition as a bike-friendly community. Bicycle projects. This is in the works right now. This is the wayfinding project along Park Avenue and Maple Avenue. Again, the idea is to create a network that connects the city to this regional system that is the W&OD Trail to the downtown areas of the city. And then the importance of a bike facilities plan. You'll see all these magenta-colored lines approaching the city and then stopping when they hit the city's borders. So Arlington County and Fairfax County have been developing their bike network, and at the same time, the city hasn't invested the same amount of time in doing that. And so we end up with this sort of disconnection between what our neighbors are doing and what we're doing. Transit actions, continuing participation in the transit alternative study for Route 7, And then looking at the shuttle bus feasibility. So George was here, George went away. Some people like that it went away, some people are disappointed that it went away. And so what's the way to bring back that service but at a lower cost? Can we partner with other jurisdictions? Can we change the routes? What can be done to make that a workable solution? Transit projects, looking at cleaning up and simplifying transit service along Route 7 and Route 29, getting a higher frequency service with fewer lines. We have pretty good service, but it's splayed out over a number of lines, and it's very hard to attract casual riders. It's a very difficult system when you're not sure which bus is going to go in which direction and when it's going to arrive. So looking at cleaning that up. And then strengthening connections to the 2 metro stations in the city, or just outside the city. Automobile actions, a lot of things get picked up here. Traffic calming, a big concern among city residents. What can be done about introducing car sharing services into the city? TDM, transportation demand management. So when projects come in, make sure that all modes of transportation are accounted for, not just automobiles, but also access to transit, pedestrian, bicycle. Taxi. And along with that, we do a couple other things, updating the traffic impact analysis, and we can look at how future technologies are going to impact travel within the city. And then a couple other things that I'm going to gloss over in the interest of time. Again, calling out projects that are in the small area plans. The idea here is to make sure that the plans that we're adopting as we go forward are always referring to one another. So a lot of effort has already gone into planning these areas, so we just want to take note of that and say, yes, we intend to implement these plans. So here I want to talk a little bit about public engagement. So over the last 8 months, city staff has gone out and participated in 16 different public meetings to try and advertise this plan. We've met regularly with the Planning Commission as well as members of the Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation. We had 2 meetings with the general public early in January and then again later in March. We've also come out to the City Council a number of times, and then we've also talked to other boards and commissions. We've talked to the ESC, the EDA. We were able to get through to HSAC. We had some problems with the weather earlier, otherwise we would have gone to them sooner. We were also able to get to civic groups, so VPIS. We were able to get to the Chamber of Commerce. And we tried to let people know that we were doing this. So we noticed it on eFocus, the city website, Facebook, Twitter, Commonplace. We wrote commentary in the Falls Church News Press as well as regularly advertised these events that were going on. To get feedback from people that weren't able to attend these meetings, we had an online survey that was up for a month. From March 13th through April 14th. And again, that was noticed through all of these tools. The idea was to be inclusive here. This is the city's transportation plan. So we want to make sure it reflects the desires of the community and takes it where it wants to go. So what did the survey have to say? The key question we had here right up in the front was, how should the city accommodate increasing demand for travel? And there were 5 options presented. Everyone was allowed to pick up to 2 modes. And there were 106 responses in favor of pet access and 105 in favor of transit. And so I think what this shows is that people are looking for more options. Certainly they're not looking to get rid of any of these other modes, but they want to see more options when they choose how to get about the city. So wrapping up quickly, the chapter is due for an update here. We've got a change in travel preferences along with what we know is going to be an increasing demand for travel. The chapter is intended to be a policy framework, a tracking sheet, like a plan for planning. What are we going to do over the next 3 years, over the next 6 years, over the next 15 years? And then public engagement. There was a real desire to go out to the public and build this with public support. All of the goals in the vision statement were actually developed by the city's boards and commissions, and they were all commented on by members of the public. You'll see various things were added to the definitions of the projects to incorporate those changes and those requests that were made. That's it. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. I imagine there probably are some questions. We can either go around the room with questions and comments. Maybe that might be the best way to start. Ms. Rogers, do you want to start off with the Planning Commission or your side of the table and ask any questions or give any comments you might have?
Actually, we saw it at our last meeting and had our questions there, so we won't take up any more time.
Okay.
With more questions. We like the report very much, and we're in support of it.
So you're satisfied with the report as it stands right now?
Very satisfied.
Okay.
The community outreach in itself was a great effort, so I'm thinking we touched as many bases as we could.
Okay, great. Why don't we go to council then? Mr. Z?
Happy to start, Mayor. Thank you for a masterful job, Paul, and
Thank you.
others on the planning and public works staff. I want us, as I said at the outset, to be known as a council that gets things done. Certainly have had lots of input on this, and I think the most important thing going forward is that we continue that public dialogue, that public discussion on things that are very important to us, such as traffic demand management for new development coming online, how we accommodate all these different modes, the potential for possible, I see 2 sets of legislation going to Richmond for safer incomplete streets, and then something with Broad. So these are likely long-term things, but probably need to be addressed. And my personal favorite, what to do with the technology that's here. So I'd like to conclude there's an app for that probably. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Z. Mr. Snyder, Vice Mayor Snyder, do you have any comments, questions?
No, just well done job from everybody's standpoint. Couple just comments about implementation, and I don't know whether it fits into the plan or not. The Route 7 transit analysis is very, very important. You mentioned it, and for the long-term interest of the business community, which gets to the Chamber's comments about prioritizing projects based upon supporting existing businesses and attracting new. And I think that needs to be a priority as we go forward. Question about the great streets or whatever we're calling those. That doesn't necessarily mean that every one of those and every square inch needs to be a complete street, but it does mean that it's going to be treated right. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, the idea behind Great Streets is just to make something that's a landscape architecture sort of attractive place you want to be. And there are a number of different examples. Then they can be oriented towards different modes of travel.
Okay. I would make a note about car sharing. From my other life, there are real insurance issues involved in various car sharing programs. So be careful where you go with that and make sure you analyze all aspects of that. Finally, parking continues to be a huge issue for implementation of this plan, and we need to focus even a special initiative on how we support existing businesses, but how we turn some of this asphalt into something that's much more attractive. And I'm thinking particularly of the downtown plan where we talked about that festival street behind our businesses, where there's already some interest from the businesses. Right now, when you go to the second story at Dogwood Tavern, and I confess I've been there on several occasions, all you overlook is a sea of parking. And we can do better, and hopefully we can to support our businesses. So I see all this sort of linking, parking, business support, making things more attractive. It all fits together. So those are the only comments I really had, and I'd like to thank everybody involved in the process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Mr. Baruch?
Thank you. Paul, this was well done, and thank you to the Planning Commission for the time that you've spent on the public engagement piece of this and putting it together. One specific area that I was trying to look for in the plan to see how it was treated was the western entrance to the East Falls Church Metro.
Mm-hmm.
Is that touched upon on the plan, or?
Yep. Yeah, so it's included in the plan. Let's see if I can find it in here. I'm not going to be able to find it very well. It is included in the plan. If you're flipping through to the transit projects, there's a map of all future transit projects as well as a text description after that. And you'll see that it's listed here, I think, as a long-term project, and that's not to mean that it's a low priority. It's just to mean that it's going to be a long time in the works. But there is text in the plan as well as an image in the map that speaks to it, and partnering with Arlington County, Fairfax County, and WMATA to make that happen.
Great. And not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I think this is a very good plan. During the budget period, Wyatt and Cindy, I raised the issue of figuring out monies for transportation improvements and overlay districts, etc. Would this plan start moving us in the direction of having those discussions if that's where we choose to go?
And you're speaking specifically of the commercial and industrial
Yes.
tax? Well, it certainly lays out our policy objectives, and it lays out specific projects. And we, in the our focus in terms of being descriptive about projects is in our commercial district. That's where our heavy lifting of public investment is going to be. And so I think, yes, I think it does provide us the case, if the council wishes to work to make that case over the coming months that there should be a designated revenue source to help us accomplish those projects, because we will be using NVTA funds, or we believe it'd be very helpful for us to be able to use those NVTA funds to expand our transportation network for all modes, and our commercial districts as a focus.
So I think to Mr. Z's point, who wants to have this council be known as the council that gets things done, which certainly I subscribe to. I think part of that is going to be putting our collective wallets to making some of these projects happen. So I don't want to be in a situation where this plan just sits, because I do think it's a doable plan. It's just going to take commitment and resources to do that. So I'd want to, once we do the public engagement, begin to quickly pivot towards how do we get some of these projects done that really will help our business community and our economic development and quality of life. So I don't want to wait until the next budget season to start figuring that process up. And I may sound like a broken record on this publicly, but so be it. But I don't want to find ourselves in the midst of the budget cycle to figure out where we're going to fill gaps that we know we've created.
Mm-hmm. One thing I will add to that, though, is that we do have federal grants and we have state money that's already been appropriated to the city that will fund a significant part of our capital improvements program right now. And so we're not hanging fire waiting for that discussion to happen. We've got a lot of work to do right now and a lot of funds that we believe that will help us do them. But that is a discussion that I think, for sustainability of that effort over time is the discussion that we will ultimately need to have.
So I would just ask that get put on the council agenda sooner than later, especially on the transportation piece that we've raised, because we know we're going to have some kind of gap happening there.
Paul has put up the schedule of some key projects. To Mr. Shill's point, they're happening now.
Thank you, Mr. Brook. Ms. Conley?
I just want to say good job. I have followed this for a long time, been involved, and I appreciate all the work you put into it, and I hope that the community engagement that you have done such a good job of pulling in now, we continue to keep the community engaged as we go through the short term and the midterm and the long term, so that people are able to identify all the good projects that will be done and what's coming next and how it's going to affect them. So,
Thank you.
Ms. Oliver?
Thank you, Mr. Stoddard, and to all of the other people that participated in this process. I have a personal passion for the idea of earning the walk-friendly community and the bicycle-friendly community. Mm-hmm. And in the current plan, it says to be determined after the pedestrian facilities program is done. Do we have any estimates for what that would take in terms of person hours and?
So we did a lot of work to try and figure out what would be involved in earning a walk-friendly status in order to get this, in order to get it included in this copy of the plan. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that under time constraints. That there's, if you go onto the website for Walk-Friendly and you get on the phone with them in person, there's this very long laundry list, and without going through the actual evaluation, you can't actually get a sense of where you stack up. And I will say that the walk-friendly status speaks not only to pedestrian infrastructure, but also the built environment in general. So it speaks to what are your parking requirements for commercial parking. And it speaks to what are your setbacks. Do you have build-to lines? Do you have complete street walls? What is your tree infrastructure like? So it's doing all these things that make walking possible, because it's not just about having crosswalks and pedestrian lights, but it's about having an environment where people want to walk and they feel welcome. And so in terms of what it would take to get there, we know that there are some examples of other cities that are probably in a similar position to the city population-wise, size-wise, level of business activity. And so what we'll be looking to do is look at what they were able to do, talk to their PED coordinators to figure out what was involved, and try and come up with estimates from that.
No order of magnitude?
No, I think no order of magnitude at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the Transportation Committee for your hard work, too, in addition to the Planning Commission. One thing that caught my eye as I watched your presentation, the slide on public engagement, how to accommodate increasing demand for travel, the top three answers are pedestrian capacity, transit capacity, and bicycle capacity, and all those are, wonderful and commendable. Let me ask you to put yourself in the position that we often find ourselves in here, which is dealing with a specific project, such as at Broad and West or such as at the Kensington, where the kind of feedback we get from the community is much more about concerns about automobile capacity, how to accommodate that, needs more parking. We hear, I think it's fair to say, that loud and clear most every time we do a new project. And the difficulty that we've had before now is we seem to be ignoring that in our efforts to, not ignoring it, but we seem to be downplaying it, I guess, in our efforts to address some of these other concerns like walkability and transit capacity and bicycling. I think it's important for us to be able to communicate to folks that we have a construct that we are trying to put these new projects into, and it is basically this program that you're presenting to us here. Is there anything, that we can pull out of here that is just a 1 or 2 pager that we can hand out, quote from, put in the newspaper to explain to people, yes, we understand that it may appear that we're underparking this according to old-fashioned suburban parking standards, but we are not according to the brave new world that we're headed towards.
Absolutely. I think this slide would be one of the key takeaways that when you do, because one of the problems when you're looking through the lens of an individual project, you're always going to attract those people who are very opposed to it. Whereas the idea here is that when you're sort of taking a step back and looking at the transportation network overall, you get a chance to hear from everyone in the community. And certainly, and it's included, I think, in the attachments, that there are some people who are very opposed to increasing bike capacity in the city. But at the same time, there are more people that want to increase it. And so I think that's one of the positions you're always in a democracy, that there are a lot of different viewpoints out there, and eventually you have to make a decision. And I think one thing you can rely on are these sorts of general surveys of the public to understand sort of what is it that the most people want. And in this case, what is it that a very strong majority wants? And we're certainly not trying to shut anyone out of the community, but we are trying to make sure that the public dollars get invested where the public is asking for them.
Okay, thanks. Just one final closing thought. The screen that you showed on projects that are planned or in some cases underway, I think is a useful one to also get out into the community. I know I've seen signs up that your stormwater project money is, at work on Howard Harmon, Stream Valley, et cetera. I mean, I think folks are willing to pay taxes if they see goods being delivered. And, because of the situation with the recession for several years, we were not able to deliver as much as we wanted. But now I think we're in the position to be able to do that. So I would encourage staff to try to get this message out every time a street gets paved. Your taxpayer dollars are hard at work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. I've got a few comments for you. Let me ask you, how will this and when will this inform new development? In other words, for example, as development comes online, will this end up with a new TDM, like in other words, traffic demand management plans or standards for the city? Will there be new standards for bike facilities? In other words, we now want 1 bike space per 3 residences or whatever it might be. Is that an output that you anticipate? And if so, when do you anticipate delivering that?
Yes, it is. If you look at in the chapter, what it does is it incorporates all the other sort of specific plans that have already been created. So the bus shelter master plan gets incorporated. So during the development review process, we would be able to pull that up and say that it has the same weight as any other part of the comprehensive plan. And then the idea of these policy actions is that each of these would then get incorporated into the city's comprehensive plan. So the pedestrian-friendly design standards would become part of the comprehensive plan. And then the bicycle facilities plan would become part of it. So as projects are going on that are neighboring to these facilities, we would be updating those things. The TDM plan would become part of the comprehensive plan. And so that's how it would be folded into the development review as part of the review of the comprehensive plan.
And how long do you anticipate that to take? For example, do you imagine this will be a period of years before these will be developed?
Yep. So I'm sorry, I don't have the years up here. Short term is the first 3 years, so 2014, 15, maybe it's 15, 16, 17. And then medium term is 18, 19, 20. One of the things that we really struggled with is that we heard from the community that there are a lot of transportation needs. But what we had to do is figure out what are the highest priority transportation needs. And so by responding to boards and commission comments, the public survey, that's what we tried to do, was order these things based on feedback we got. And so when you look at things like the TDM plan, it's been identified as a need, but it's a medium-term priority. And so in the interim, what we'd be doing is we'd be doing what we've been doing to date, which is sort of an ad hoc sort of approach to each of the individual TDM plans as they come in. And I think there can be some real benefits to doing it ad hoc a few times, just to sort of get your feet wet before you go out and adopt a policy anyway. So it may seem like a negative, but it has some positive aspects to it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions before we let Mr. Stoddard go? Yes, please.
Regarding implementation, I heard the conversation between Mr. Brooke and Wyatt, and I was wondering, does the city have the manpower and capacity to be able to implement such a plan? Do we have the FTEs required to be able to do this?
No.
And will they, because
Sort of a loaded question.
because with this type of funding, you need somebody to be able to implement this, and without that, we lose the funding. So,
Yeah.
Pardon?
No,
So
I
it's
mean-
just a cautionary note to to people who want to speed, to move ahead with implementation.
Yeah.
You also have to look at FTEs.
And I think that there's been several discussions on that. One has been just the FDEs in supporting the projects and the CIP overall, and how do we piece that together. And the second has been sort of the oversight, because of the money that would be flowing with some of these projects, and an oversight function that's needed. So we've talked about it in a couple different ways. But I think that's got to be part of any implementation plan, at least in my view, to figure out, do we have enough resources to manage the projects as well?
The city council did a very positive thing in funding 2 positions in the CIP, which is something we haven't done in the past. But because we have new funds, and we have a large transportation capital improvements program, we have 2 funds that are now going to be charged, 2 positions to be charged 2 projects. And they'll be responsible in moving those projects forward. So that's a big change for us, and that's very positive. We will focus their efforts in the commercial districts. One of the areas where the lack of staffing is probably most frustrating for our citizens is in residential projects, traffic calming projects, sidewalk requests on residential streets. Those, in terms of the cost of those projects, is very small. In terms of the neighborhood engagement, the cost is very high. And we have not gotten to a place where we're able to really move those projects forward very efficiently. Now, no place is. Arlington is typically 4 years to delivery for their neighborhood enhancements program that they have. They're very hard, they're very labor-intensive projects to do, and that's probably where a very visible shortage of staffing resources is right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, could I
Yes,
just?
please. Of course,
I'd like
Ms.
to
Hunt.
build on something that Phil Duncan was talking about. I don't think that many of our constituents, citizens in the city know that we are responsible for our own roads and for the care of those roads and for paving and everything. And if you go outside the city and see the conditions of VDOT roads, I think it's something that we can hoorah about.
Well, we'll take that as an opportunity. In today's Metro section, where the front page picture was the potholes, that was a Fairfax County road, not a Foster Street.
Well,
But that's not to say we don't have our challenges here, and our ability to keep on top of our paving is a resource question as well. We get our money from the state that's supposed to help us take care of our streets, and it's not adequate.
right, but I don't think people even realize that we are responsible for and own our own streets. And that's a pretty big deal, considering another thing that's under care with the taxes that we don't probably publicize enough.
Right.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we wrap this up? Thank you, Mr. Stoddard, for a job well done, and for you and your staff and the Planning Commission as well on this product. It's quite good.
Thank you.
So we are scheduled to come to council on May 27th for adoption of this chapter, is that correct?
Yes, it'll be May 19 to the Planning Commission for their adoption, and then May 27, which is the Tuesday council meeting for final approval.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Shields, the next item?
Okay. Next item is the Kensington development. And what we'd like to do is allow a focus to be on the proffers in our staff presentation tonight. And I'll mention the reasons why in just a moment. But this, as we do our presentation, I think I'll take the lead in just going through the bullets, but we'll have a phalanx of key people who can speak to them in more detail and respond to questions. Lauren Bruce has been the principal planner on this project. Rick Goff on the negotiations on the combined payment, as well as Mr. Taves. Nancy Vincent has been involved in the affordable housing units discussion. And of course, we have Mr. Ed Novak and Mr. Harley Cook, the developers for this project. And I'll say at the outset that they've been very responsive to our requests. And the project has changed, I think, and particularly with respect to the proffers, in meaningful ways since the council referred this out to boards and commissions. And so it's really with the benefit of those boards and commissions' input that we've then worked with Mr. Novak and Mr. Cook to try to address the concerns that were raised by the Housing Commission, by the EDA, by the Planning Commission, by the AAB through this process, and we believe we've been successful in doing so.
Mike with the undergrounding.
And Mike Collins is there with on the undergrounding utilities and streetscape things. Thank you, Lauren. So if we could, in the staff report, if we shift actually to attachment 1, which lists the voluntary proffered conditions. It's this attachment. And we'll just touch on those. The reason that this is important, the city has, over the past 12 years, conducted special exception negotiations in a manner that's very consistent with state law. It's a manner that's been used in other localities and has been used by the city very successfully for 12 years. With this project, with the in consideration of other options that are available to us under state law, we have chosen to take a model that's more typical of Fairfax County's land use approval process. So that is different than the way we've handled special exceptions in the past. And one of the differences under the city's own ordinance, under proffers, that the Planning Commission has an opportunity to have a public hearing on the proffer package. And then once the Planning Commission has had its public hearing, it is then referred to the City Council. And if there are any changes to the proffers under our own city ordinance, any substantive changes to the proffers, then it's to go back to the Planning Commission for another advertised public hearing, which would be a significant add-on of time to the project approval process, and one that the developers have put us on notice that they don't believe that they could manage. And so we do want to make the Planning Commission's hearing as comprehensive and complete as possible. So if there are substantive changes from the council, we'd want to hear them tonight. Then we would verbally relay those to the Planning Commission and comply with the city's own ordinance on that. Is that clear?
Well, I tell you, if I could interrupt you for just a second, just for purposes of clarity, because it is something different than we have done in recent past. Could you describe, for example, if there are any changes that would require a 30-day delay, in other words, for advertisement and the like, before it goes to the Planning Commission? If there's a change after the Planning Commission, then it goes back. Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit more so people have a sense of what would be the timing if, in fact, there are any changes? Do you have just kind of a general sense you can impart to us?
Jim, could you speak to that, what the timing would be to have it properly advertised?
Well, you'd have to finalize the different changes, and then you'd have to have 2 successive hearings in advance of the Planning Commission and then City Council. So it'd probably be at least about 6 weeks, I think.
So, are there any changes subsequent to your Planning Commission hearing, which is on what day? Tonight? Okay.
Cinco de Mayo. Yeah.
So if there are any changes after tonight, there is a 6-week delay. Is that essentially what we're being told, to go back to the planning commission?
What if the city council were to adopt any recommendations from the planning commission? That wouldn't be changing anything, would it?
Right, so it's like what we
Yeah.
approved tonight, if they accept.
Yeah.
That's right. So what the planning commission has its hearing on and then recommends to the council, that's when further substantive changes can't be made.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to make sure that people understood the implications of any, I caught something later on kind of change.
Right, well, and for clarity, just, it could, so we're not hamstrung in the future, it just delays the process.
That's right. That's right. And so we want everybody to be aware of that. The good news is that I think we have made very positive progress on these proffers, and we have good things to report. So just going through them, one change on item 1 is the conceptual development plan. It references specifically the conceptual development plan, and that includes the architectural finishes and the plan that the council has seen and has gone through boards and commissions. And it notes the most recent revision of April 28th, 2014. 2, it ties it to the architectural elevation drawings dated March 31st. 3, the parking study. And then 4, the transportation demand management plan dated April 7th. And that's very important in terms of managing the parking on the site. So the approvals are tied to those 4 documents with their specific dates. Item 2, the supplemental payments. Here's the concept that's enshrined in these payments. The concept is the project wants to pay its fair share of taxes. And so with the supplemental payments, we believe that we accomplish that. First, in Section A, it lays out that there will be a combined payment schedule that will ramp up to year 3, which is the basis on which all the payments will be made henceforward with an escalator. That figure of $235,000 is based on a construction cost of $18 million for the project, and the current tax rate. That is correct. So then thereafter, from year 3 going forward, there would be an escalator to that real estate tax payment amount. There'd be real estate taxes plus the payment in addition to the real estate taxes that would be tied to the increase in taxes paid by a basket of the 10 highest assessed commercial properties in the city. And so the idea here is to tie it to the market increases that they have, plus any increases to the tax rate that might occur in any given year. We want to pull out any properties that are rezoned or have a big change to them, new construction. Because we're not trying to capture market appreciation plus new construction. We're just at this point trying to capture market appreciation as we go forward. And so we believe that that basket does that. And I will pass out to the council just and the Planning Commission a chart that lays out some of our analysis of what that escalator means when it's tied to a basket. First, we just noted that if you take all commercial property in the city, if you look backwards over the past 10 years, on average, each year commercial properties have grown by about 4.8% in terms of the taxes that they've paid to the city. If you take the basket of the 10 largest commercial taxpayers, and this is the area that has the sort of the salmon-colored part in the chart on this side of the page. If you take the 10 largest commercial properties, which includes properties like the Eden Center, the Kaiser property, Federal Realty's property, the Coons Ford property, and other very familiar properties in the city, their increase in taxes has grown by an annualized rate of about 5.1%. We do note the reason for the inclusion of the chart at the bottom of the all commercial property tax receipts is just to show that there are some years where it will grow more than the norm, and there are years where it will grow less, and there are some years where in fact there will be a negative change to the taxes that are paid by this basket of 10 properties. That is the norm over time. But taking this 10-year window, at any rate, we have some sense as to what the performance is that the property would be tied to. And again, the principle is the property wants to pay the taxes that commercial properties, its peer group, are paying. On the other side of the page, in terms of how the project meets the special exception criteria of substantial net new commercial revenue, if you take the top line, the Kensington at that time we were calling it the pilot, but the numbers are still the same, would yield $403,000 of net annual revenue per acre. And that is in the higher quartile of the special exceptions that have been approved by the city since the SE ordinance was adopted back in the early 2000s. All the comparisons are for mixed-use projects with the exception of the Hilton Garden Inn. This project then in the Hilton Garden Inn for pure commercial projects that have no residential component to them, this project in the Hilton Garden Inn have the highest tax yield on a per acre basis of any commercial properties in the city. We also note on this chart on the right-hand side, because the SE ordinance calls for a net increase of revenue relative to what's there right now, we net out the revenues currently generated by the Burger King, and if you do that, the net yield is $270,000 per acre of new revenue to the city, and that puts it in the bottom half of the SEs that have been approved to date. So we provide that data for the council. One of the key directions from the City Council after first reading was to address the long-term fiscal contributions of this project to the city, and I would recommend or commend the changes to the escalator clause as being a major step forward in allowing us to accomplish that goal on this property. I'd be happy to pause before moving to other proffer conditions for any questions about that, because there is a change since the council's last seen it.
I think it's probably a good idea. I don't know if Mr. Baruch is chair of the EDC. I know you've considered this extensively. If you have any.
We haven't even talked about this.
The new version, you mean?
Correct.
Okay. Well, are there any comments or questions from Mr. Shields as he pauses to deal with this particular issue? And afterwards, he'll continue on with the other issues. Anyone have questions, anything they don't understand? Andy?
Yeah, I got a couple questions. The basket of properties, does that change over time? Or, for example, in here there's a bunch of, I guess, valuable properties, but there aren't any of the sort of newer things like either the ones that are going online now or have been online recently. And I'm just wondering which is a more representative sampling of how the value might change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also mentioned redevelop. So, like, if Eden Center redevelops, does it come off the list forever, or just during the redevelopment time when it's kind of out of whack with its assessment?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you read the section B, it provides how this will be handled. So the short answer is the properties that are included in the basket can change over time. The basket of properties will contain the 10 highest assessed commercial properties that exclude the following: A, new construction through lease up to 85% occupancy, and then B, in the event that a property in the basket of properties is redeveloped, rezoned, damaged, destroyed, or substantially renovated, it will be removed from the basket properties for that year and replaced with the next highest assessed commercial property that meets the above criteria. So what we're looking for are stabilized properties. That's what A stands for. A project that has, if it has been reconstructed, now it's leased up, and now it's a stable property. It's being assessed on the income approach, and now it's back in the basket.
Right.
But if something changes in a year, it'll be pulled out of the basket for that year, and the next largest will slide into its place.
So, okay. So I'm wondering, is the size of are the highest assessed properties, do they grow at the same? I mean, just because this is a property is smaller and assessed at a lower value, I don't know that. You know what I mean? Like, is that the appropriate number to try to peg it to?
The data that we do have, just looking past over the past 10 years, it does indicate that the largest assessed properties grow at a slightly higher rate than the whole corpus of commercial properties in the city. The reason, one of the initial reason we didn't include the whole all of commercial property in the city is that that does include new construction.
Right.
And it includes a whole lot of other sort of extraneous things that could be going on. And so by picking a basket, that was meant to be a pure measure.
Right.
By taking
I just-
specific properties, a pure measure of what's going on in the
Yeah, and you
market.
got to pick something, and maybe this is appropriate. I'm just wondering if, prime real estate on Broad Street has a different growth than the 10 most highest assessed properties that are, if you look at them, not very many of them are on, the main drag. So that's a question I have. I mean, to be totally clear, I've been concerned all along that we're trying to mimic a system, and this seems better than what they had before, which was just the flat growth based on some sort of made-up number. So I generally like it. I'm starting, this is the first time I've really spent much time looking at it. And then my other question is, just because this is so complicated and I would say unusual, maybe it's not that unusual, is there any risk that 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, there'll be some legal battle over whether or not this is okay and it would all go away and revert to whatever the normal tax approach is? I assume the city attorney would weigh in on that, which, I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, any discussions about that we would want to have in closed session in terms of any risks to the city. But we do view this as an agreement between the city and the developers that lasts for the length of the use that is covered under this special exception, and it has the weight of contract law.
Okay. That's all I got.
Yeah, I guess a couple points. One, it's taken me several readings to figure out what this is. And I've had some separate email conversations with Mr. Shields about this point. And two things that I'm concerned about is, at one point there was discussion about trying to tie this to a known index, whatever that is. And the response back that we got from the applicant was, well, that's too unpredictable. So now we're trying to tie it to a local index. But I've got significant public policy concerns on the notion, and I don't think this is going to be a driving factor, but this gets back to what Andy was talking about, this notion of taking properties as they redevelop off the basket. Seems just like a flawed place to go. Because if this was a larger project and one that we were very much depending on, it creates these perverse incentives not to have properties redeveloped simply by keeping it within the baskets to have a project continue to generate the profitability, because you want to keep it in the basket. So I just think that there's a weird incentive built into this, which is to not to have items come off the basket, because you want to always have it be your richest bundle. And just this notion that they're going to come off as they redevelop just seems a little bit strange to me, because then you end up sort of with your lowest common denominator at the end of the day once everything's redeveloped down into the future. So I just question that sort of notion that they would come off and never to be coming back on. I just think it's a strange concept to deal with. And I, for one, would be more comfortable and prefer just an index that's a little bit more simpler to follow, whatever that index is, rather than try to tie it to various commercial properties and then figure out when they come off simply because they're redeveloped and they're off the bundle, if you will. I just think that that's a strange concept, to say the least.
Let me address the first one first. In terms of an index, like an index that is outside the city, one of the things that would be missed in any such index is the impact on the city's own tax rate. And that's really important in terms of maintaining equity and comparability to what the rest of the commercial sector in the city of Falls Church is paying. One example, if we were to have a commercial and industrial overlay in the future, there is no index outside the city that would capture the fact that commercial properties ultimately might be contributing towards that. That's a decision for the future, but this method allows us to capture that effect. So I think that is an important determinative to try to keep it local. Second, I think it's important just to understand the role of the basket. The basket is meant to be a proxy for what's happening in the market. And so if a property comes out in a given year, another one is put in, it's only to measure the change in a given year. So you get a percentage change that you then multiply by the amount that the developer is paying. And so it doesn't matter that much, if a really high-value property is taken out for a year while it redevelops and then it's plugged back in, that really wouldn't have any bearing on the way the system would work.
Where does it say it comes back in?
Because the basket of properties will contain the 10 highest assessed commercial properties in the city. I mean, that's right.
Okay. Maybe that's something that needs to be wordsmithed to be clear, because when I read it, and I think when Andy read it, we got to the same conclusion separately without talking to each other, that it came off. And if that's not the intent, it's lost in this.
I mean, I see what you're trying to do, which is, hey, this Eden Center is worth X dollars, and it gets redeveloped, and so the next year it's worth 10X because now it's this giant big thing. We don't want that to mean that this thing now goes up 200%. You want to reset it at the new stabilized value. So I understand that. It was a little bit confusing. My biggest question is just whether or not the 10 most valuable ones are actually reflective of projects on Broad Street of this size, and whether or not those might actually grow at a different rate.
And part of the reason for just taking the 10 largest is so we have a standard to go against, so we don't argue every year which properties are in and which aren't. There's an objective measure. These are the 10 bigs, and that's the basket.
Okay, any other questions on this particular item?
Could I?
Sure, Mr. Duncan,
I just want to
please.
follow up on what Mr. Brooks said. So just to be clear, the phrasing would be, it's taken out for only that year, and it's meant that in the subsequent year, if that property were in the top 10, it would be back into the basket. Is that correct?
Let me look to Ed and Harley. We've talked about this. I think we are in a very common understanding as to what this means. But if there's an additional clause at the end that would say, removed from the basket of properties for that year and replaced with the next highest assessed commercial property that meets the above criteria, and then the basic concept is if in the subsequent year it is stabilized and is among the top 10, it gets added back in. That last clause is not in there. That was implicit in our understanding, I believe.
I think the natural progression would be that a property is taken off the market, it's redeveloped. Presumably that would take a year, and then it leases up to 85% occupancy. That may take another year. But as soon as it reaches 85% and is on the top 10, then it goes back into the basket.
Okay. I think that Mr. Brooks brings up a good point, and Andy too. That could be made just explicit. I think that would be helpful. Sounds like the process you describe is the process that is desired, at least by me.
Any other questions or discussions on item 2?
Sure. Vice Mayor Snyder, and then Mr. Z, and then Mr. Brute.
I don't want to prolong this. This has been worked on very hard by a lot of people, but why 10, why not 5? Because if you have 10, you're going to try to, the effect of having 10 will be to drag down the average increase.
Not necessarily. And I don't think the data necessarily supports that. We did look at the top 5, and it was very similar to the top 10. And so the 10, I think, just provides greater stability to the basket. But so, that less fluctuation. Sometimes that fluctuation is good for the city. Sometimes it might not be. So I think that was the intent of 10. But
Mr. Z, or did you have anything else, Mr. Z?
Thank you. I would observe that what we have at this point appears to be for me, a easily understood, graspable index. 10 largest provides stability. I think that arguably that's probably the best index we could come up with regard to what affects us and the equity issue involved. I would also say that there is over the last 10 years, just looking at this chart here, 4 years below the 4.8, 4 years above the 4.8, and then 2 years that were right on. So I think what this gets for us is moves discussion out of whether we have assisted living over commercial or should it be housing. It gets us out of the whole discussion of taxation on the basis of income, which we know is inequitable, which started this whole discussion to begin with. And now what we really have is a purely commercial facility, indexed to commercial rates. And I'm ready to move out on this.
Thank you. Was it Mr. Baruch and then Mr. Duncan?
Just two questions. First of all, on the 85% occupancy, is that about average what fairly occupied residential development does? I know that they can't be at 100%, but given that they always have some vacancies, is about 85 a fair number?
I think it's a fair number. I think that when there is new construction, typically the city assessor will assess things initially at the construction costs or at sale comparables, and then they, eventually transition to the income approach. The income approach is the most reliable indicator of commercial value for a stabilized, leased-up property, and 85% is a good standard for that.
And I'd be interested in hearing from the Economic Development Office. I know that they had worked on this proffer, trying to get it to essentially what they thought would be more in line with what we were trying to do, given the particular assessment model that we had to work with. So I'd be interested in hearing from Rick and getting their thoughts about the proffer, specifically on this combined payment schedules. And also whether it rests on any assumptions. Because and what I'm getting at is we don't want to be, well, at least, there's been questions raised about whether this is subsidized or not by the city in part. So if there's any underlying assumptions that we're operating on saying that this is actually a good proffer for the city, I'd like to know if there's any underlying assumptions or any valuations that we're relying on.
Well, the main valuation that it relies on would be the construction cost of the new building, and that combined with the land value. So here we're assuming 18 million. So we're taking the developer's information on that.
And we haven't seen the pro formas on that. Is that right?
We have not.
Okay. So that's the baked-in assumption.
It is a baked-in assumption, right?
Anything else, or is that it? Okay, Mr. Duncan, and then...
Sorry, just to go back to the chart, the far right-hand column, the net numbers. You'd said that the number for the Kensington shows up in the bottom half. By that measure, just looking at it, I want to make sure to understand that that's largely, as I see it, because it would be replacing a how to phrase this, relatively more successful underperforming business than did either the Northgate or the Spectrum or the Broadway. Is that correct? Northgate replaced a defunct funeral home, the Spectrum replaced an empty field, and the Broadway replaced a out-of-business AdCom building, whereas the Burger King is a going concern. Some might reasonably ask why we're moving heaven and earth to, produce a project that does not rank as high as some of these others, but one of the major reasons is what I just said. Is that correct? Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, or we should move on? Let's go ahead and move on, Mr. Shields.
Proffer 3 is the developer has agreed that the project will be built to standards that would allow it to get LEED Silver status, and will post a $25,000 bond that would be released by the city once that LEED Silver certification is achieved by the Green Building Council. For undergrounding of utilities, the developer agrees to underground all the utilities at its own expense along West Broad Street, frontage of the property. That's 4 poles. and will underground all connections under West Broad Street to the other side of the street. And there's really two principal poles that they need to connect to. They'll get underground service to those poles, and then service will resume above ground, but off-site and on the other side of the street.
If I could just stop you for a second, did city staff then get all the poles underground that they had desired? I recall there was a pole across the street that was in contention for a period of time. Has the developer agreed then to underground that pole or remove that pole?
There's one pole that serves the two office buildings on the other side of the street with overhead service. That pole will remain, but the service to that pole will be underground. The transformers on that pole will be removed. One of the issues with going all the way to the service points of those other buildings is that that would be work on private property, and developer has not agreed to do that work on the other side of the street.
And the transformers, for example, on the other side of the street, are they going in boxes right next to the street, or where are those going?
Do we have those details yet as to the location of transformers on the site?
It's between.
Yes, they will go on our property, as Warren said, between Hilton Garden Inn and our site. So we were going to have one transformer serving our property. Now there will be our transformer as well as the transformer serving the other side of the street.
And where would the one on the other, serving the other side of the street be? That you're stuck basically on the sidewalk or right behind the sidewalk?
No, off of the side, behind a screen, but between the two buildings, between Hilton Garden Inn and our site. So it'll just be stacked one behind the other.
And they will be screened?
Yes.
Okay, and is there going to be a transformer across the street at the office building
No.
as well? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. The fifth proffer relates to the retail spaces, and there's two sections, A and B. The first deals with the southeast corner retail space. That's at least 1,900 square feet of interior space and 900 square feet of raised outdoor seating area that will be approved as part of the site plan. And at the corner, the retail use shall be limited to restaurant, food, beverage, bakery, or confectionery use. And B, the arts retail space, that's 1,100 square feet of interior space. That is offered or proffered that if it's to be used as art space, that it will be provided at a lower rent that's at least 50% of what the square foot rental rate is for the corner space for that arts use. If it's a retail use, then there are certain uses that are not allowed, and they're spelled out in section B3.
Why don't we just pause for just a second? Are there any comments or questions about this particular condition or proffer? Ms. Conley?
In the arts retail space, there's a long list of not permitted uses. Is that a typical list that just went in there, or are these specific to this property?
That's kind of a noxious uses list that we have used in other contexts.
Okay.
It's something in code.
Makes sense.
Other questions?
Yes, I have two questions. One, does the build-out for the southeast corner retail space, kitchen shall be fully ventilated with fireproof lighting for casual food service uses, does that limit it?
And let me
That
just
space?
let me correct what I just said a second ago. There's nothing inherently bad about those uses, but for a retail frontage, a primary retail frontage, that's where they're not looked for.
didn't think
so
they were hazardous
strike
to
what
our
I said
health.
before. That was not the not the way to describe that.
They're not noxious, nor dangerous.
Tell Sally
to our
of the chamber on you.
Ms. Rogers?
Okay. I want to know if the build-out on the one retail space for casual food service uses, does it limited to casual food service uses, or is this a restaurant build-out that might accommodate a different type of restaurant? Do you understand my question?
This is for the second retail space, the not the corner space?
No, the corner space, space.
I think what she's asking is because it says it's built out for a casual restaurant, does that limit it to a casual
That's
food
what I just
service,
said,
or
yeah.
can you expand it to a full-service restaurant?
1,900 square feet, I don't think works as a full-service restaurant.
Well, even if it's not a full-service restaurant, would it be usable for some other type of retail?
Let's allow Mr. Novak to address that question.
Ms. Rogers, if you're referring to the ventilation, that would serve as a full-service restaurant.
Okay. I'm just thinking in the future, if something should change in that building, would you be able to use that space for something else? And number two, on the arts retail space, this is something that you're agreeing to but have no contract on. This is something still to be worked out with either the arts or whoever comes in there as a retail space, is that correct? I mean,
Yes.
you have no contract with Falls Church Arts.
We are in negotiations.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I have a few comments if no one else has any. One, I guess the word raised in A, I'm wondering if that should come out. I mean, since it's a proffer, if you had to come back and it was actually at grade, which I think would be perfectly fine, it's probably unduly restrictive and unnecessary in here. In other words, it could be a grade or it could be raised. Personally, I prefer it to be a grade. Secondly, with respect to the art retail space, it seems like it permits a pretty broad range of uses. Although it lists, 15 things that can't be done, it still seems like the universe of things that are permitted are fairly broad. I mean, would that include things like a Taekwondo studio? And maybe that might have the right amount of space for it, but cosmetic dentistry, that sort of thing. Are those things? Those would still be permitted through this proffer, correct? I guess what I'm getting at is, to me, I would really like to see, given that it's such a small abbreviated space, in other words, we have surface parking so that you don't have a full-depth retail, and it's going to be challenging for this half block to enliven, in my opinion, the streetscape, particularly if it has a use such as a dentist or something like that. And so my preference would be to see something along the same lines as the uses for A, which are restaurant, food, beverage, confectionery use with arts added. In other words, take what's allowed at the corner and then add arts as well as a second possible use. Is that something that would be agreeable to the developer? What I'm getting is try to ensure a higher quality retail than might otherwise be permitted in the cities, given that this is a special exception.
I understand the objective, and I'm sympathetic to it because that's what we want too. I'm just a little bit concerned about how exclusive that might be. I mean, if for example, we had a wine store, or I mean, I think a traditional retail uses with the exclusions provided, and maybe with the exclusion of office space, which is what you were concerned about. I mean,
well, maybe that's, so, for example, you might be okay with pure retail and the selling of goods of some kind and a
Right.
restaurant, as opposed to service commercial style things like the dentist and that sort of thing. That
Correct.
would be agreeable. Well, that would be something that
I support Dave on that. I mean, I'd rather see the usages that we want to see in that space further clarified. I think Dave, you had a very good suggestion on how to do that. And Mr. Novak knows how to come back for an amendment if this thing gets approved, if he can't fill it. So I'd rather be more restrictive and get the type of use that we're trying to aim for rather than the uses that we would prefer not to be there. I think a positive list is more helpful than a not positive list in incentivizing the program. So let's look at the positive of what we want rather than the negative of what we wanted, which is, I think, where Dave is trying to go.
Ms. Rogers?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the smaller space, the arts retail space. Is it possible that they would be able to sell things there as well as exhibit? I mean, that would be a more vibrant retail space. And would we be able to ask that was something that we would want to have done in that kind of a space, and that it would be fully staffed so that it would be open to the public at all times?
Well, what I was getting at is a space that would be more retail-oriented, either arts, retail, or restaurants. So, in other words, having some kind of restriction that it could be for art, the sale of goods, retail sale of goods, or some kind of restaurant, food, bakery, beverage, or confectionery store, and really taking out the service commercial style type of uses such as the cosmetic dentist, the Taekwondo studio, and that sort of thing, which nail salons, et cetera. And so that would be something that I would hope we could try to work out here in the second part, is a restriction or proffer along those lines.
We would agree that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's go on, Mr. Shields.
So in terms of changes, just so we understand procedurally, if we could work after this meeting on wording so that we can then take that to the Planning Commission, make sure that we're all on the same page, and then be able to proceed.
Okay.
And that's the notion of having a positive list with the limited uses that we would want right now, right?
Yeah,
I think we just articulated a moment ago.
Yeah.
You know, retail, arts, and then the list above here, the restaurant, confectionery, bakery, et cetera.
Mr. Shields, can I ask a question and direct it toward Pat, just because was kind of hearing a little bit, or I may have confused the issue earlier on. If we go upstairs, Planning Commission goes upstairs and, you know, goes through our recommendations, they come up with some wording down here that solves some of these issues. We take that upstairs and they approve it and recommend it. Does that get the problem solved of the
28 days.
You still gotta
Is that your question?
Yeah,
Whether
do
they
we
have to go back for another
do
public
we have
hearing?
to go back for another public
Not
hearing?
not if the owner puts it in writing and signs it as a proffer with all those requirements.
Okay.
That's the process we're
Okay.
describing.
I may have confused that earlier on.
Mr.
Okay.
Baruch?
Wyatt and Jim, just, it sounded like part of what was the language that Dave was talking about was the retail use. And again, I'm losing the thread of this, but I know that we had a problem with how the code was defining retail use before. I can't remember if we fixed it or how we fixed it, but I just remember that there was a problem with that. So whatever you all work out, it can't be whatever version of the code that we had that retail use was like drive a truck through it, that led to lots of problems in this discussion to begin with. I just can't remember if we fixed it or not.
Yeah, we're alive to the problems we've had in the past with the definition of retail.
So don't put retail in there if it means everything under the sun.
Okay, let's move on to the next point.
All right, item 6, Nancy Vincent and Dana Lewis are here in the audience and can answer any questions, but I'll just summarize it very briefly. How this has changed since the council saw it at referral out was that it was presented at first referral as 6 ADUs. And those ADUs were subsidized at a rate of $1,300 per month. And the concern is that helps address a moderate income need in the city, but our experience at Sunrise Assisted Living is that we have very few applicants for moderate income assistance for units there, where the need is for low income, a higher need for subsidy. So what the developer has agreed to is that dollar amount, which is 1,300 times 12 times 6, $93,600, will be made available as a subsidy for staff to use through the ADU lottery process that we currently use with Sunrise, or some very close facsimile of that process, and then we'll be able to use that subsidy to support people who meet eligibility, income eligibility, and asset qualifications to have use of this facility. And so this allows us to meet a need that we think actually exists in the city. We think that, as a matter of fact, the numbers of people that we'll be able to place will be closer to 3 beds at a time as opposed to 6. But those would be 3 low-income qualified candidates for these beds. And so it does give us more flexibility, but it will very likely be that we will not have 6 beds occupied at any given time. It'll be more like 2 to 3 with this amount of subsidy. And so that's the key change there. So the positive thing is that it more directly addresses the need that we have, but if it were, it won't be the 6 beds most likely as we discussed the first time.
Can I offer a comment on that?
Well, maybe let's just see what the questions are and see if there are any responses that we can give.
Mr. Baruch?
And this will let set the policy of how we administer that program?
It will, and
And let me just cut to the chase. I mean, if we wanted to give a preference, for example, to city residents and employees
Oh,
or
yeah.
families, that we could do it that way.
that's our standard policy, yes.
Okay.
And that is how the qualification, in terms of the lottery process, that is how they're ranked.
And it looks like there's an escalator built into this
Yes.
to keep up with
That's
climbing
right.
costs.
So that 93,600 will grow over time based on the inflation of the market rate units.
In that building, right?
In that building.
Okay, any other comments or questions on this particular proffer? If not, why don't we keep on moving, Mr. Shields?
Nancy, I think I might have overlooked one point, or anything to add, Nancy?
And there's a wireless microphone there, Nancy.
I have two comments. One, that Mr. Shields described the process as being a lottery. In this case, it would be a wait list. So the city would maintain a wait list, and as space becomes available, then the next person on the wait list would be offered the space. So that would be a little different procedure than with the other ADUs in the city. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that one thing that city staff had asked for, as far as the $93,600, is that any unused amount of subsidy be carried over to the following year. And the reason for that is it would be actually impossible to have the amount of subsidy equal exactly $93,600. So it'll always be less than that, because we can never there would be no budget to go over that. So the amount of residents would have to be kept at somewhere way below that, because as people use services, it would use up more of that subsidy. I don't know if I'm making myself clear with that. So what we had asked is for any unused amount to be carried over, and that way it could be used in the subsequent year, and that wasn't agreed to. So this current proffer says that any unused subsidy will not be carried over to the next year, and that amount can be small, or it can be several thousand, or $10,000 or $20,000. So just to make it perfectly clear to everybody.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Any other comments, Mr. Farouk?
Well, I would support staff's recommendation, it sounds like, to see if we can carry over the money. Because otherwise, a lot of things could happen in a given year. You may not be able to utilize it or fill all the beds for whatever strange reason, or you have population shifts or whatever they may be. So if we're going to get the money, I'd rather keep it into the system.
And we understand that, and I will just note that we had a good negotiation on this, and at this point we didn't achieve that, but and so I don't.
Well, it sounds like there's going to be other changes. I would ask the developer to take a look at that, because again, our hope, at least my hope, is no matter what the outcome of this, is that this be an aspect of this is, given how expensive assisted living facilities are, that we can help folks in the city meet the needs, and one way of doing that is through making it affordable for folks. And there could be a gap if we're not able to carry the money across years. So again, I hope the developer will consider that, so the city's not leaving sort of money on the table, if you will.
Okay, next proffer, Mr. Shields.
Item 7 is simply just to note the stormwater management requirements for the city, and the developer agrees to meet all of those. Item 8 is a proffer to provide an emergency generator. This is very important for our overall city resiliency and emergency response, to know that this building is going to have backup power in the event that we lose the grid. Item 9 is a proffer for a bus shelter and shuttle service. And in it, the owner agrees to construct a bus shelter with appropriate signage and landing pad amenities at the location to be determined by the city manager during site plan approval. In lieu of building the shelter, the owner shall pay the city $15,000 prior to obtaining the building permit as its contribution towards the bus shelter elsewhere. So in other words, if during site plan we decided we don't want a shelter there, there'd be a payment instead.
What does the bus shelter cost?
$15,000.
Okay, so that number's right. We're not cutting ourselves short.
Well, we have a budget for bus shelters as part of the council's bus shelter master plan, and so we think that's a good number.
Okay.
And then lastly, there's a reference to providing a shuttle service to East and West Falls Church Metro stops for its employees, along with financial incentives outlined in the owner's approved TDM plan that is addressing the parking issues in this building.
Mr. Rankin?
I just had a question about those TDM plans. Did they ever expire? Or are they ever reviewed, 10, 20 years down the road?
Mr. Stoddard?
Microphone.
So we did work pretty extensively with the development team to put together the TDM package that they have now. And there are a couple key pieces to it. One of them is an escalation clause that's built into the TDM. One of the things we looked at is typically when you have a development project come in, there's a desire to put underground parking in there, which is very expensive, but not necessarily to provide motivations for other modes of travel. And so what we worked at was something that's called a parking cash out. So the idea is that as employees come into the site, they have an option of taking a free parking space. If they choose to forego that parking space, they can get either $100 a month in a transit subsidy, or they can take $50 a month in cash. They can also cash out at the $50 level if they choose to carpool instead of driving alone. So the idea is you're recognizing that parking is very expensive and that it may be better economically for the developer to provide other transportation benefits that also has the benefit of getting cars off the city streets, which is something the city's interested in, and reducing congestion over the long run. So the idea is you're creating the situation where everybody's benefiting, that the employees are getting cash back for taking other travel options, the developer has to pay less to build the project, and the city's reducing congestion on the city streets. In terms of the escalation clause, those numbers that I mentioned, the $100 and the $50, those are geared at achieving a particular mode split among the people that are going to the site. And the idea is that every 6 months you would go out and assess whether that mode split is being hit. So the mode split is 40% using transit or 30% using carpool, whatever the target is. If that mode split is not being achieved, there's an escalation clause that those cash out prices raise by $25 every 6 months. The idea is that you're taking advantage of free markets and pricing signals that eventually you're going to hit a price point where that mode share will be hit, not because people who really want to drive are going to be eventually bought out and go with something else, but because people who are interested in these benefits are going to be attracted to work at this facility.
Any questions for Mr. Stoddard? I have one, if no one else does. So what's to stop someone from taking the $100 a month and just parking on the street? In other words, how can we regulate that as a city that someone won't, just commute and end up on the streets around this building?
So we have a couple of ways of working with that. It's in the employee agreement. Ed, do you want to speak to that?
Written into the employee agreement, any employee that does drive will be given sticker, and it will be written into the employee agreement that they have to park at the Kensington. And they won't get the incentives for Metro, and they will not, get other incentives, but they would have to park at the Kensington. And a violation of that is a violation of the employment agreement and would be, ultimately could result in termination. And we expect that neighbors would report that. And
So how about the parking around the site? In other words, I believe is it 2-hour parking immediately adjacent? Is there any thought of anything else to, for example, putting meters in there to make sure that people don't overstay? I don't know what kind of enforcement there is now, but in terms of trying to keep the parking associated with this building corralled inside the building as opposed to spilling out in the neighborhood, any thoughts on that, Mr. Stoddard?
Sure. What you're trying to protect against is what's called parking overflow. So you're trying to hold the parking, as you said, contain it in that site, and there's an opportunity for it to spill over and create sort of a negative externality. So you want to avoid that to the extent that you can. Other communities have had this same problem, and they've been able to address it through parking enforcement. So Arlington County, City of Alexandria, they've been able to put parking enforcement in place for 2-hour parking or parking with a permit only, and they've been able to effectively prevent those sorts of overflow problems.
Mr. Shields?
I'm sorry, can I just ask?
Sure, of course,
Sorry.
Ms. Oliver.
I just want to see if I understand this. If they violate the employment agreement by driving when they've said they're not going to, what are the consequences?
The employment agreement says that if they do drive, they must park at the Kensington. If they park on the street, that's a violation of the employment agreement, and there would be disciplinary action.
Okay, so what about in the case, for example, of an employee that Metro's 219 days of the year, and one day of the year they need to go to the doctor and they drive directly from the doctor to work, and then they then need to park, otherwise they can't make their shift
Sure, and they would be able to park at the Kensington.
without a sticker.
I mean, those types of exceptions can certainly be worked out.
It's a good question. Could I just...
Doc, of course.
Mr. Stoddard, I'm thankful for all the detail of your response. I'm just curious from a public communications point of view, are the folks who live particularly next door and in the immediate neighborhood, I know you all have had some meetings with them, are they understanding of all these things, aware of the things that are written down here, generally approving of it? Ed, I don't know, can anybody give us some feedback on where the neighborhood is on learning about this and reacting to it?
My understanding is that the development team did meet with the neighboring property. I'll hand it over to them.
Yes, we met with residents of the Broadway last Thursday night. We did explain that we have a TDM with the city. We went over some of the details of that. So there was that communication. I'm sure some of them are here tonight to learn more about hearing it from the city.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Novak. So, Mr. Stoddard, is your professional opinion that the regime that's outlined here and has been discussed is consistent with the earlier presentation that you gave as to this building? In other words, this building would be contributing to the future that we hope to have here in terms of mobility for all modes, and that the steps would address that and also address the concerns of neighbors that are typical for this kind of building in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think it would. So if you look at what's going on with the incentive structure, again, I'll go back to the point that parking is very expensive. If you provide that at no cost to the traveler, they're going to be financially incentivized to take that mode. And so what you want to do is try and level the playing field of the incentives that are being provided to everyone. So if people are effectively getting a subsidy from free parking, then you want to make sure that they get a subsidy from reduced fares on transit, paying someone to take a bike instead of take a car. So right off the bat, you're starting to provide that mobility for all modes right there by leveling the economic playing field among people's choices.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, obviously, Vice Mayor Snyder.
Let me try to wrap this discussion up this way. There's certain assumptions are built in about employee parking, about other parking uses, other parking in connection with other uses at the site. If, as a result of any of these factors, you have parking overflow, was that the right term? Does a TDM provide a remedy so that the neighborhood can feel confident that whatever the source of the overparking, it can be dealt with?
One of the things we've been looking at in the escalation clause is either a $25 increase or some other remedy. And one of the things that we've been talking about, although I don't think we've written it down in the agreement, is looking at what is the opportunity to lease parking spaces in neighboring facilities.
Right.
So we know that the Hilton Garden Inn is a hotel. They're going to have most of their parking demand at night. This is a facility where you're going to have most of your parking demand in the day. Similarly, at the Broadway just across the street, they're going to have their parking demand at night. These folks, again, having the parking demand during the day. So you want to look at how can you use the resources that are available, not just in the building, but also in the district to take advantage.
Right, I agree with that. So, but your answer to my question ought to provide some measure of security, that we've projected the number of spaces, we've projected the use, we've planned, and we have built in here as good an effort as we possibly can have to control the parking. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, I think that escalation clause is going to help to control the parking. The other thing that will help provide some amount of security is a survey of other facilities in the area. Talked to the development team about putting that together. We weren't able to get it together as soon as we needed it to, but that's certainly something I think we could get to before the site plan.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes,
Could I add something? On this
Microphone. Thank you.
Sorry. On this paragraph 10, it appears as though there's an internal inconsistency because on the one hand, they say that the employees will have to can't park on the city streets between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m., which seems to suggest that at other times they can. And then in the last sentence, it says that everybody will park in the parking garage on the subject property during their shift, which would cover the whole day. So you may want to address that internal inconsistency. If you don't care about the 7 to 5, then maybe we can make a change to the second sentence. But if you care about the 7 to, you want them to be parking at all times on the property, then you want to take out that 7 to 5, or ask the developer, the owner, if they'll agree to that.
Okay, well, I think they just nodded that they are agreeable to that, so maybe that's taken care of. Thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Taves. Next comment, Mr. Shields.
Could I add one other thing?
Sure.
The word especially on North Lee or Park Avenue would suggest that they can park on other streets, so I would take out the word especially, and especially on North Lee or Park Avenue. I'd just take out everything after that comma. Is that okay? Okay.
Any objection
Thank
to
you.
those changes? Okay, fine. Let's go on, Mr. Shields.
All right. 11 addresses bicycle storage. The owner will provide a bicycle rack with a minimum of 20 spaces, space for 20 bicycles. Item 12 is parking in the TDM plan, which we've just discussed.
Not to belabor this, but just
Yeah.
a quick point. Will the bicycle parking be available to the general public, or is it inside the garage so that people won't be able to, the general public won't be able to utilize?
Both. We have
Okay.
internal parking and external.
That's fine. Great, thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Shields, go on.
Okay. And since we've talked about the TDM,
Fine.
basically just we won't have to read through this whole item, but if there are any other questions on TDM, we can get to those.
I think in the future it'd be helpful for you to provide the TDM to the council.
Okay.
All right, keep going.
Item 13 sets parking garage height and travel lanes, and that's so it will be sufficient for a 20-foot long emergency vehicle to traverse the garage. Item 14 ensures that the parking garage will work for our public safety radios. Item 15 sets the minimum parking space widths in the parking garage. 80% of them will be at least 9 feet, and the remaining will be at least 8.5 feet, none smaller than that. Item 16, this lays out as an option for the city, and this is something to be decided at site plan, for the city to have the owner maintain the streetscape improvements on West Broad Street and North Lee Street. And we need to work through that policy question on West Broad Street. We did do that as a pilot at the reserve at Tenor Hill, and so we leave it as an open question here to be resolved at site plan. 17 provides a crosswalk and bump out on North Lee Street. And 18 notes that the architectural improvements that are noted in the conceptual plan will be built, and that's particularly important with respect to the amount of brick coverage in the project.
Briefly, just a brief interruption. Is there any crosswalk improvements going across Broad, or is it just across Lee Street? In other words, you're going to put new thermo tape or whatever across Broad Street, or is it only across Lee Street? Okay, because that certainly that intersection is due for something on all four sides. Just for your information. All right,
Okay.
continue on.
Then the other proffered conditions are standard language at the end of the proffers, and I won't read through all of those in detail.
General comments, omissions, anything people would like to discuss, planning commissioners. Mr. Z, did you have a comment?
I do. This goes specifically to the comments made by the Environmental Services Council. Part of the difficulty of not having a sustainability manager on the city staff is that the environmental stuff gets either put in by members of planning commission or city council. So that's not a sustainable strategy going forward. But how do we address their comments with respect to getting as many points on energy as possible, installation of conduit for a future photovoltaic system, installation of permeable pavers on the outdoor walk surface, and 2 electrical car recharging stations, or conduits instead of actual recharges, which, chicken and egg, you have to do one or the other, sometimes both. How do we address those comments?
Well, in the LEED certification process, I think all of those would be qualified activities that you can get as part of LEED certification. So the short answer is
I'd like to have a positive commitment.
Yeah.
Make it prima facie in the documents.
We're committed to conduits for both of those that you mentioned, for the possibility of solar in the future, and electrical charging for automobiles.
That's great, thank you.
Other comments, questions? Mr. Duncan?
Just one question. So is 19D where the leverage lives to make sure that the process of demolishing and construction goes happily in relation to the neighbors? There's going to be a representative physically present. I mean, is there standard language for how to make sure that the inherently disruptive process of constructing a big building is as minimally disruptive as possible?
that sets up a communication protocol so that when there are complaints, there is a person that has authority to address those complaints, that we know who that person is.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments? I have one. I was looking through some of our prior voluntary concessions in anticipation of this meeting, and I noticed that we have loading dock and loading dock times, things like that. I didn't see that covered in here. Is there a reason why that's not in this document?
Well, we've had those for a grocery store use just because that was a real point of sensitivity, and we didn't understand that to be a point of sensitivity with this project in terms of loading. So it didn't rise to a concern that we felt needed to be addressed. But
I mean, I think in general, my own thoughts on the matter are that we should have a standard expectation of when loading will occur, and that's not 4 a.m, despite what an occasional delivery truck might want to do, and that we ought to have regular hours that people have an expectation they're not going to be disturbed, at 6 a.m, because that's the truck route's time, and then we have regular hours so people won't have a trash pickup or other trucks beeping and making noise across from a residential building at any time that someone might want to make a delivery. And so I guess I would encourage us, both in this particular matter and in subsequent matters, to try to adopt a standard of what we want delivery times to be. In other words, trucks backing up into the place and backing out for certain hours of the day and not 24 hours a day within their own possibility. So I don't know if anyone else shares that concern, but I certainly think it's a reasonable request.
I think it's reasonable for this one, and then perhaps long-term we can address it in the code.
Are there any other comments? Yes, Ms. Oliver.
I would just like to ask Mr. Shields and the rest of the staff if you are confident that all boards and commissions had a fair opportunity to comment before we got to this point, and that council has received all perceptions from those boards and commissions.
I believe we have, but let me turn to Lauren Bruce, who's overseeing the process.
Ms. Oliver, we have really tried, given that this was our first attempt to have everybody come to one meeting, but in spite of that, when we sent out on 2 different occasions the notification, we said if you want to provide comments, you can go ahead and do that anyway. And so, for example, the AAB didn't respond. We reached out again and said, hey, just as a reminder, this is the day we need comments if you have any. And we still have not received. So
They were present at the meeting. We had
Yeah.
2 or 3 representatives there, so
Right.
they were there.
But I'm just saying that I'm very confident that those who wanted to submit something in writing did so. And we got some just today. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce, for example, issued their recommendation today. So you haven't gotten it yet, but we literally just got it. So they were a week behind the date that I gave them, but we sent it out via email to the Planning Commission. But
And one thing we would just note with the AAB, they did meet with the applicant earlier on in the process, and I think had a lot of valuable input into the architecture of the project early on. I mean, some of the early changes and the increase in brick coverage and the architecture of the building was AAB was involved in that.
Mr. Mayor, I've got one question. In terms of when the Planning Commission goes upstairs, is it your thinking that Mr. Harley and Mr. Cook would stay here and work on the proffer, and then we take it up to the Planning Commission?
No,
Or what?
I don't think so. I mean, I hope that that can be written in 5 minutes on the way up there almost, and everyone head on upstairs and do your thing in the Planning Commission.
But if we make these changes, it's my understanding that if we go upstairs and make changes and bring them down to you.
No, you don't need to do that.
Not tonight, next
You
month.
just, the planning commission needs, we'll talk, I think everybody.
Okay, well, I was just responding to what
Mr.
Pat-
Taves, go ahead. This is a confusing process because of the different process than we're used to.
Mr. Mayor, with respect to the loading dock hours and the trash trucks, do you have any particular hours that you want us to talk to the developers about?
Well, trash is in the code, right? Trash pickup.
I don't think all this. There may be decimals numbers. Look, I would just ask you to go take a look at it. I don't have any particular numbers in mind, but I do think it's appropriate to protect our neighbors from noises and disruption in odd
Maybe we
hours.
could do that at site plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
But
you.
I think, and it has been done in other cases. So, look, it's up for you guys to consider, but I just raised it because I think it's a fair point for consideration. I would also ask the developer to just consider thermoplasting the rest of the crosswalks. Just consider that. It's something to me that we can clean up that whole intersection. I believe at a reasonable extra cost, but it's something for you to consider and the Planning Commission as well. So with that, unless there are any other comments, why don't we finish this matter and move on to the next one? Thank you very much, all of you, for your time on this matter.
This is just getting introduced, right?
What?
This is just getting introduced.
Yeah, it's just going to be 5 minutes. It's not going to be a long thing. Well, Jim's
No,
problem.
no, he didn't. Lauren, quit asking that question.
Jim, do you want to drive or just tell me when to drive?
I can,
You do?
Make this quick.
which one?
A real 5 minutes.
Let's pass these out.
Okay.
If
Mayor
you're
Charter,
leave-
members of council, members of the Planning Commission, as a partly a setup for this discussion, Jim did work with staff to put together a brief PowerPoint presentation, but we do recognize the time constraints that the council and the Planning Commission has. Planning Commission has another meeting to go to tonight. The intention of this discussion is to set up a future visioning
Absolutely.
discussion about this. And so let me just pause and ask what's the most efficient way to set this discussion up. One of the key things that I think we do want to communicate is that in terms of thinking about a retail strategy and development, commercial development in the city, we do have a lot of resources of prior studies, information that we've gathered in the past to address this central question. And so part of what we were going to do is describe what we have done in the past as a setup for what we could do in the future to take advantage of new opportunities that we have in the city, specifically the Harris Teeter project and what it will do to help spur retail development in our downtown core.
I don't think we need to go in so much to what we have in the past. The idea, at least that I had, was just to set up this for further discussion at a later point. To just plant the seed of a discussion and a structure for discussion going forward, and essentially just have an introduction to this subject. This is something we discussed at our council retreat. It's going to be part of the work plan. In other words, giving direction and guidance to the development community, adopting, for example, standard expectations for conditions and proffers and the like, and just teeing this up for further discussion. Tonight is not the night to have an in-depth
To
discussion,
resolve
but
them,
just
right.
to set the stage for a further discussion and the structure for a further discussion. And so I think just maybe a brief introduction to the subject matter, and then we'll carry it on that discussion for a later point.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. We have put together a PowerPoint that, with the help of our planner, Akita Rosie, and we've been looking at, there's a lot of good information that the city has had in the past, including a 2005 retail inventory study that we think is an excellent base and should be updated given our present conditions, so that'll give us a baseline. Also, Arlington County has done a lot of work, much of which I'm familiar with, on retail action plan for the Roslyn-Ballston Quarter, and there are quite a number of studies that were done by economic development looking at specific retail activities and approaches. So those are things we can also make available as a reference for the city. So this PowerPoint does go through some of the analysis of the 2005 study, which pointed out some of the key issues, insufficient parking, competition, lack of retail space, pointed out where our retail competition is, and some of that has grown with the opening of the Mosaic retail area. And then also points out a lot of things that have happened since that study. We've really overperformed in terms of a lot of retail has happened where we've had mixed use. We've really gotten a lot, and a lot of that is because of our special exception process. So you can go down the list and see a number of the uses. One of the biggest things has been the BJ's Wholesale Club, 24-hour fitness, rehab of existing buildings, filling those in with newer retail uses. That's been an important aspect. And most importantly, more recently, the Harris Teeter, Fresh Market Grocery, and the Eden Center grocery stores, which are bringing a total of 125,000 square feet of groceries in 3 strategic locations in the city, along with other uses. So as we look at those, we look at things we might need to do in the future. Updating that retail study, which was excellent, and maybe engaging the same firm to bring it up to date given where we are now. Identifying desired commercial uses and locations by category. Are there things we can do to improve retail conditions? How do we guide future development to complement existing retail anchors? So these are some of the basic categories that are in the literature and that we've put together of different types of retail. And then this looks at the kinds of uses we'd prefer to have on primary streets, our main streets like Washington and Broad Street. And so you can see these do not tend to have service uses, do not tend to have studios where we have blanked out walls and windows. This is promoting active interaction between people providing the business and retail service and the public on the street. Secondary uses, which are important, but perhaps should be on secondary streets, these are some of those types of uses. Banks, generally you don't want 5 banks on every corner, on every street, but you might have 1 bank on a corner, particularly when they own it and you want to integrate them into a bigger building. So here are some of the issues on urban design principles that need to be identified. And we need to have quality streetscape. The retail environment, the physical environment is an investment by the city and the developers that's very important. Quality architecture with appropriate windows, fenestration, signing, the correct community character, storefront materials, et cetera. So looking ahead, what would we be doing? I think first off, we need to maximize the positive impact of these new grocery stores and the BJ's, and how can we develop first-class retail uses on the adjacent properties. They are the anchors, and as development occurs around them, how do we get the best that we can from them and near them? They're well-placed, and there is a lot of development that could happen near them that should provide good retail. We need to promote more active restaurant and entertainment uses in the downtown core. Mr. Snyder mentioned the Dogwood Tavern. We need to facilitate upgrading and improvement of restaurants and add new ones. focusing those primary retail uses that were in that list on the main streets and the secondary and service uses on secondary streets. I think it's vital to go ahead and update that retail study so we get professional information about where we stand now that we've brought all this more retail to the city, and then look at our retail base, identify future trends, identify the community's desired commercial uses, develop a retail strategy plan, update retail design guidelines, and importantly, seek input from the broader Falls Church community regarding desirable uses. So that leads us to engaging the community stakeholders and customers, from business owners, the city departments, community groups, property owners, residents, employees, and key groups like the Planning Commission, Economic Development, Chamber of Commerce, and owners of major retail centers in Falls Church. So these are some ideas about ways forward, looking at good information that's available, updating that, and making the best opportunity that we can as we look at projects near these key new approvals that are going to be anchors and should generate additional retail positive growth in the city, in the locations near them.
Thank you for the brief presentation, Ms. Oliver.
Can I just ask a general question, Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Do we have in the current budget or next year's budget the resources, either in terms of staff time or funding, to do this in the short term?
Well, I believe the present budget includes a marketing person for the economic development staff. I don't know, we don't know what the cost would be to update that study, but something we could look into. I think that would be very valuable, and a lot of work was done. It's kind of an update. Mr. Manager, do you have any other thoughts on that, on the resources?
We, at the council's next work session, want to provide a draft council work plan, and what you will see in that draft work plan is a very long list of things across the city, but also in development services in particular. And so I think this effort, I think, we would want to have this discussion in the context of all the priorities that the council has, and then assign resources appropriately. One thing I think, a direction that we think we would really benefit from, though, is if we did have standard conditions and standard proffers, just as one example, that should make everybody's lives easier in terms of the writing of these proffers, the evaluation of them by legal counsel and by staff. And so that would be upfront work, but it would have a long-term dividend in terms of workload.
Thank you. Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot. It occurred to me that there are several larger data points that I'm not sure I see here on your slide 8. The first is, I think we need commercial tax generation by use, by occupancy. Does a hotel generate more than a grocery store? Does a grocery store generate more than an X? Whatever. So I think there are data points there in terms of tax generation. Second thing, it seems to me, is to give us some models of other communities like ours that are, once were suburban, now are increasingly urban, sort of surrounded by major retail centers, but have actually done well with their uniqueness. In other words, the non-Tyson's Corner. And what were the factors that made that succeed economically, and what were the factors that made that succeed from a quality of life standpoint? And I would suspect that you're talking about celebrating the history, the arts, community events, having great schools, that sort of thing. The third thing I'm interested in is, what sort of population increase do we need to shoot for? I mean, we've been told for years, we need to pile more people in here. Okay, we've done that. We've gotten some increased commercial activity, but we're far lower in terms of percentage of tax yield than we ought to be. I think we've just gone through the budget, and I think that's been very clear. So, and then you have to put into that school costs. What is the point at which the increased population, whatever they support in terms of commercial activities, is more than offset by the costs that they exert in terms of new school buildings, for example. So these are the kinds of things I'm interested in going forward. And then a public engagement process, certainly involving key stakeholders in our community, VPIS, the schools, and on and on and on, League of Women Voters potentially, certainly, our key boards, the Planning Commission, that goes without saying, EDA, et cetera. But Anyway, those are a couple initial reactions. I'm interested in tax generation by occupancy. I'm interested in models about other communities that are similarly situated. How did they succeed? What process that they followed? What were their objectives? And then dealing with residential population. What do we need? Do we have too much, too little? And what does that do to inform us in terms of our development decisions going forward?
Thank you. Other comments? Why don't we go ahead and wrap, Mr. Duncan?
You thought you were going to get out quickly. Just one community that I would like to see us engage with on your screen number 9. After the Northgate ribbon cutting on Thursday, Becky Witzman and a couple other of us talked with the leasing agents for the Northgate and the fellow who does Pearson Square. And I was just struck by the practical knowledge that they have of our community and how, from their perspective, we fit into the big picture. Most of this won't come as any surprise to you, Jim, and not to Rick or Becky either, but I think it would be helpful for the community to hear from people who are out there professionally trying to lease the spaces in our particularly mixed-use buildings about the challenges that they face because of the particular characteristics sometimes of the building, but really of our community, the way it is. We don't have 8-lane highways like, we want a mosaic district. Well, no, we're not going to get a mosaic district because we don't have an 8-lane highway with a signalized intersection or whatever. Even a mini mosaic district, but that particular group of people, I think it would be good to engage. Some of them have done, I think, good work, and some of them at some of the other buildings seem to be taking a little longer than we might wish, and I think it'd be good for us to have conversations with that group of people on a more regular basis.
Thank you. Unless there are any other comments, why don't we go ahead and shelve this discussion, just an introduction tonight, and have further discussion as we talk about our work plan and other related items.
And I think one thing, this was, I would say, Mr. Mayor, you asked on this to be done very quickly. Akita Rozio is here, our new planner, did a lot of this work and research. We got her through the zoning office and promoted her to planning because she's a really good, smart person. And she did a lot of this work. But this is a major work effort. And Paul Stoddard, who's doing transportation plus comp plan update, plus a lot of other things, you're going to need people to do these kinds of things. And you need more capacity if we want to do a full-blown retail plan, that kind of thing. So particularly with the public engagement, the effort you saw with Paul Stoddard going forward, this is it's time intensive, it's worth it, but there's a certain amount of things you can get done. And so whether it's small area plans or retail planning, and that's one of the things Mr. Shields is going to bring forward with, what are the choices for the council in terms of what are the things that can get done. So I wanted to thank her for her quick work and putting this together as a beginning. And we certainly are going to talk about it more with the Planning Commission, because I think they and the EDA can help provide good input to the council. And Mr. Snyder's remarks, the study that was done did, I think, if it were updated, could be focused to answer many of those points. I think that would be a very valuable update because it did get at some of those, and we could ask those questions directly.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily use the same people. That study really, if I recall, really deliberately lowered expectations. I don't really want to start with lowered expectations at this point. We may get there, but I'd like to shoot high.
Yes, well, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, planning commissioners. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
May the force be with you.
All right, do you want to take 5 minutes? All right, we'll take 5. Start at 10 till.
All right, we only have one item left.
All right, okay, why don't we go ahead and get started, finish up our meeting. Could you all be seated, please? Mr. Shields, are you going to present the staff report? Or?
I'm going to turn it over directly to Nancy Benson, Director of Human Services.
Good evening. Thank you for coming.
Good evening. I'm here. Whoops, oh, there's Rick. Okay. I'm here with Dana Lewis, who's our housing program analyst for the city. And to her right is Jeannie Cummins Eisenhower. Did I get that in the right direction? With the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board. And Rick Goff, who you know, the director of the Department of Economic Development. And the reason that we're here tonight is to ask council to authorize a resolution to issue a request for proposal to develop the land at 366 Washington Street. And Dana Lewis very thoroughly and expertly headed the effort to come up with a proposal in front of you, and she will do the presentation.
And I'll be brief. We've already come to work session once on August 12th in 2013, and at that time we presented options for the development of the city-owned property, and that was based on the recommendations of the focus group. And city staff also recommends demolition of the current structure, which is in great disrepair, the Miller House. At the work session, council, you all asked staff to explore 2 options for the property that included, one was special needs housing for persons with disabilities, and then you also asked us to explore commercial viability of the property. So economic development explored market interest in the property, while housing staff issued a request for information, or RFI. Based on the results of both inquiries, staff is now requesting approval to issue the RFP that includes the attached scope of work that you have in front of you. The scope of work includes information taken from the RFI and includes the option to lease the city-owned property at $1 per year with a long-term commitment. No property taxes would be assessed, and developers also have the option to apply for funds out of the Affordable Housing Fund, and there are no other long-term costs associated with the property. It's recommended that the facility would serve 4 to 8 low to moderate income persons with disabilities, and city residents would receive priority consideration. And as Nancy said, we have 2 experts here. Rick can talk about the economic viability that he looked into, and then Jeannie is here to talk about the needs for, she could talk about any questions that you might have about the needs for group homes and also the numbers of persons that are able to go into group homes. And like we said, we were looking for 4 to 8 low to moderate incomes, and she could address any questions that you might have regarding that.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. Question, comments? Mr. Baruch?
I think this is well thought out. I think it makes sense, and there's clearly a need. I'm sorry. I think there's clearly a need, so I think this makes a lot of sense, especially with the loss of, I believe it was the other group home that got sold. The one question that I have is, there seems to be sort of an indication of and again, I don't mean subsidy in a negative sense, because I think that some level of subsidy makes sense on this. So it would be a $1 lease that would happen. But then there's also a notion that the project, if it comes to fruition, could apply for the city's affordable housing fund.
Yes.
So in essence, there's 2 subsidies. I think what I'd like to see is that since they're getting essentially a break on the lease, that a certain number of units be made available for city residents at a reduced cost, rather than sort of dwindling the limited resources that we have on the affordable housing fund, if that makes sense. Because they're already, in my view, already getting a pretty big break as I'm seeing this with the $1 lease.
The project, and Jeannie could probably address this as well, all of the residents would be assisted, would be low-income residents. It wouldn't be a market rate, so to speak, kind of a project. So there would be clearly subsidies for everybody, and city residents would have first priority on the project.
Okay.
So the affordable housing funds could be used for pre-development, development, to raise the current structure there. They would not be used for any kind of ongoing subsidy for the project.
So what would the residents be expected to pay?
You want me to address that? Okay, so the way that services generally work with That's okay. So the way that the payment for services generally works in group homes that are funded through Medicaid, which is probably the main mechanism for funding this type of group home that would be contemplated, is that individuals will pay up to 75% of their adjusted monthly income toward their housing. And Medicaid's Home and Community-Based Services Waiver Program pays for the remainder, and that covers the cost of the long-term care services that are occurring. Almost all the people who are going to be accessing this type of group home are people who receive supplemental security income, which is approximately $720 a month. So they'll be paying 75% of that $720 a month, which is essentially paying for it's actually going toward paying for. It never fully covers the cost of things like utilities, property insurance, lawn care, those kinds of expenses. And then the waiver comes in, and the waiver pays for the cost primarily of the staff to be able to provide the 24-hour support and supervision and assistance to the residents.
I think I understand. So with all the various pieces of this, they wouldn't actually be paying, or the family's paying.
Right. It's really a public funding source paying for the care.
Okay.
It's individuals paying up to 75% of their monthly income towards basically a contribution to their housing costs. The operator is probably going to be finding other funding sources to make up some of the difference, because that 75% never truly covers 100% of their operating costs, but it covers most of their operating costs. And what helps them to cover those operating costs are the fact that you're not going to be charging real estate property taxes, and the fact that they're not going to have debt service because you're only charging them $1 a year to lease the property. The other thing is if they're able to access your affordable housing fund, depending on how you structure that loan, they can then go and do things like not renovations, but they can pay for things like modifications to the property. So when they do the construction, they can add features that are going to significantly enhance the accessibility of this property, because many of the people that they'll be serving are going to have mobility impairments and other functional impairments that require a lot of adaptive structures in the home. So that will make the home a much more easily usable, functional place for them to live.
Great. And how is Pendleton House?
I was just going to say, the Pendleton House, we used its precedent. We used the Affordable Housing Fund. Actually, Jeannie was, she worked with them on that deal, and so they used funds. It was a loan that we gave them that they do not have to pay back. And so that was used when they built Pendleton House, which is in Fairfax County, but city residents, I think there are about 4 of the residents that are in there currently. And so that was how that deal went ahead.
Ms. Conley?
So we don't have anything like this in Falls Church City right now?
No. There were 3 and now there are none.
But
residents, we do have residents at Pendleton House. It's
Right.
just in Fairfax County.
So would those residents then move back to Falls Church City? Or they stay where they are and this is for other residents?
This would be for other residents.
And then will Fairfax County or Arlington County residents be able to live there too if there's space? Or how does that work?
Sure. Well, so Falls Church is a part of the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board. You have an agreement with the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board to be able to receive services through that Community Services Board. So when the Services Board provides case management, and that those case managers are required to be able to link people to available services, including residential programs. So they will be making referrals to this opportunity as well. The difference being that that there will be a restriction or a priority or preference for people who live in Falls Church to be able to get these slots that are available first. So the case managers will be aware that folks who live in Falls Church and who have residency in Falls Church will receive a priority. However, if there are vacancies, we don't want to see vacancies in a home ever, especially for a long time, because that can really negatively impact a provider. So we will leave it, we can leave a vacancy open for so long, but then we have to fill that slot. And so if the next person in line is a person who is a Fairfax County resident, we'll fill the unit, or we'll fill that particular bed with somebody who happens to be from Fairfax County. But we will first, when it opens, make that initial offering to people who are residents of Falls Church as a preference.
Other questions, comments, Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. I do notice that this property is 0.1725 acres, which is small, and it's been vacant for a long time. I also not hearing from Economic Development Office. I presume that the fact that it's been vacant for past several years probably means that there's very little commercial interest in this.
Yeah, we actually proactively contacted our network of commercial brokers to see what kind of interest there would be, and
they told you group home. Thank you very much.
Basically, yeah. The expressions of interest were either non-compliant with the limited T1 zoning, or there was withdrawal of interest once they actually took a look at the property and had an understanding of what it would cost to rehabilitate or tear down. It's a tiny lot too. It's only 7,500 square feet.
Yeah. So I understand that if I'm hearing this right, that there would be a long-term lease for $1 a year, and you would make $285,000 available from the Affordable Housing Fund, beyond which is not contemplated there would be any further contribution from the city on either an annual basis or long-term. So tell me, when you say long-term, what does that mean? What should that mean to me? Because eventually this facility will also become old and obsolete and will need to be torn down. So you guys are in this business. You probably know that better than me, but I would just like to know what you mean by long-term. And then further with that, if you could just continue the discussion, just talk generally about what happens if the operator defaults, sells or merges with another entity, or subordinates this operation to somebody else. I mean, there have to be legal protections, I would assume, without recourse back to the city.
Do you want to answer the question, Jeannie, or Mag, or do you want me to answer the first question?
I'm going to give it back to you because I'm not
Okay.
sure how you all want to handle that.
Okay, so the answer to the first question is long-term would be the life of the facility. And so it's usually, 70 years for a group home, or that long, or less?
Well, I mean, we have providers that have been operating group homes in place for at least 40 years that I'm aware of. So, and while they need to be refurbished and often remodeled, they continue to operate.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the case of a default, was the question? In the case of a default, the property is city-owned property, and the facility that was constructed there would become city-owned property.
Well, that goes actually to the question. So what is the fiduciary responsibility of the city to continue the operation? Or I guess that these questions all go to what happens if something bad happens. So who has to pick up the slack, basically, is the question.
And the city would not be responsible to continue operating at the facility if there was a default.
What I can tell you is that this actually, we've got a little bit of history with this. There's actually there's a housing organization that this recently happened to. The housing organization was separate from the provider organization. So we in fact, my organization, the CSB, was the provider organization in that scenario, and there was a nonprofit housing provider that received funding from the Fairfax County Housing Authority to in the form of a no-interest loan. They defaulted. The house was foreclosed on. The housing authority went back and went to auction and actually got the house back for us. We now lease the house from the housing authority, and we continue to operate the house. So I imagine that we could probably structure something similarly where if the city of Falls Church were to retake ownership of the property, the CSB would work with the city to be able to reissue another RFP to find another provider of the services. So because in this particular RFP construct, you're actually asking the developer to be both the developer of the housing and the operator of the services. So you would be looking for somebody in the case of default to actually replace both the owner and the operator. So that is something that we would probably have to work out between the two organizations. But my suspicion would be that the CSB, because we are intimately involved in making sure that services are actively and ongoingly available, that we would have some obligation to assist you in making sure that an RFP is let so that we can make sure that there's another provider that can step in and provide those services.
Okay. Other questions? Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot. When I first read this material, I said, I don't understand the basic deal here. And after some discussion tonight, I understand it better, but I think the public's had no exposure to this at all. And when I total up the city's taxpayers' contribution to this, we're basically giving away the land. 1 year, $1 a year lease is basically giving away the land. What's the value of the real estate? We're potentially committing an additional $285,000. We're going to be waiving taxes, all to serve 4 to 8 people. So this is the kind of question I have, which is, I didn't understand the deal at all, and I think the public, and I'm not saying a long time, but the public needs to understand the whole deal here, and you don't get that from this material. And it's not something that I would be comfortable for taking a final vote on without the public having had a chance to look at this in more detail. I don't understand why you'd have a private party in here as opposed to do it directly, because for the reasons that we just talked about, these things fail from time to time and end up being back in public management anyway. I don't understand, is this the #1 priority population? Is this the number of people, the maximum number of people that we could serve for this public expenditure? So I'm looking at it both from a service standpoint and from the standpoint of this particular deal. And I appreciate that you put it together within certain confines, and within that view, it looks good. To me, coming from the outside, I found it very difficult to understand what the basic deal was. And the discussion tonight was helpful, but I don't think the public has had any of this. And until I commit public resources, I want to know, I think we need to put this out to the public so that they understand better what it is we're doing. Also, since we're basically disposing of public assets, I think there's at least a supermajority requirement for this. So I want to get more of a sense about just that we need to describe this to the public, and we need to compare it to other uses for the same money. I also note that it's in a commercial area. It's in T1. Could it be combined with other properties in the area and have commercial value? Would this be better somewhere else? These are the type of questions we're going to ask, that will be asked of us. And the answers are not all in this materials at this point. So I want to see some more information to the public. I want to see a couple weeks at least for the public to have this information so that we can vote based upon public input.
Mr. Baruch?
Just on one additional point on that, on the, if this is, and again, I underscore if this is the best use of it, understanding that sort of Sunrise is right next to it and the redevelopment potential may be limited, how we arrived at $1, because again, it is a subsidy. I'm not objecting to the subsidy, but how we derived the $1, which it's, whatever the value would be for a rehab, or how did we come to that, and also the terms. To Vice Mayor Snyder's point, we're going to have to explain some of that and make sure that we understand the finances, because I think some of these enterprises can be private entities that generate revenues, even if they're in a nonprofit structure. So I just need to get a better sense of, why we're putting the amount of skin that we are into the game. Is it a profit-making organization? Is it truly a nonprofit organization, et cetera, before we commit to subsidizing the project? And I'm not opposed to necessarily subsidizing it, but we need to get a better sense of who, what, where, and why, and to what extent we're subsidizing. And again, I'm open to subsidizing. I just need to know why and how much and to whom.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, Ms. Oliver?
Mr. Shields, was there any consideration given to converting it just to a park?
That has been discussed in the past. I think in the North Washington Streetscape plan, there was a proposal for a pocket park there. And in terms of highest and best use, there was discussion about this back in August about, whether that was the highest and best use. And at that time, the discussion with the council was, let's vet the commercial opportunity here, and then let's also put out the RFI, the request for information, from the social services sector about the potential to meet a social services need on this site. So that's what we've come back with. So the park has been considered, but I think it has also now been put aside to try to get a higher use.
I guess
probably just because of its size.
Right. I mean, I am struck that it's on one of the major corridors of the city. People coming from the metro, walking up to State Street, the State Street Theater, are going right by here if you're headed to the downtown commercial district. I frequently walk this route on my way home, and a place to sit down halfway up that very steep hill would not be all that awful. I look at the cost of what it will take to get us a facility for 4 to 8 people, and I'm concerned about that cost-benefit analysis. I don't know what it would cost to do it in another location. But.
Okay. Other comments, or let's wrap up this discussion. It sounds like we're hearing some desire to have a little more information, and I think probably a little bit more of a public process. I don't know whether the neighbors have been engaged. I don't know if there are any immediate residential neighbors. I imagine they're commercial neighbors, but are there residential neighbors abutting this property in any fashion?
Really, it's in between. I mean, we have Christ Crossman on the left side and Sunrise on the right, and both of them were involved in our, focus group, and they really would like to see persons with disabilities served, to the point that Christ Crossman has offered parking, for residents and for persons that work there, because they want to see it, happen so badly. And one thing I did want to just have Jeannie mention real quickly is because you talked about the number of residents, and we're constricted in that. And she's just going to explain real briefly why.
Briefly.
Okay. So the Commonwealth of Virginia has been under a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice. And the settlement agreement is around Virginia's efforts to create more integrated home and community-based services for people with disabilities, because Virginia has historically placed people in less integrated settings like the Northern Virginia Training Center, and on waiting lists, as opposed to engaging them in services that are in their homes and communities. So one of the provisions of the settlement agreement basically says that if you are going to place people in a residence of a group home residence of 5 people or more, then you're going to have to jump through a series of hoops to prove to us why it is that those folks have to be in a home-like setting that is of a higher ratio of people with disabilities to people without disabilities than you would find elsewhere in the community. And the Department of Justice sort of set the bar at 5 or more people. And what that means is having to go through several layers of bureaucracy in terms of groups that you have to prove yourself to as to why somebody needs to be in a larger type setting. So that's why we're looking at trying to reduce the number to be
Sure.
able to stay within that Department of Justice agreement.
Okay, thank you. It's just running late, and I think
I
everybody wants to
understand.
wrap up. So, I mean, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that people would like some more time to reflect on this, and that I don't think it's really ready for our immediate future in terms of next week. And so I would suggest maybe that we spend a little more time, take a half step back, and try to get some more information as requested by some of our colleagues, and just kind of see where that leads us. But I don't think this is ready for reading next week. So that would be my thought, unless someone else objects or feels differently.
No, I agree with that. Now I'm thinking that we also need to get a sense of sort of, given some of what I've heard right now, whether, what the need is in the city, or there's other ways of utilizing the funds, or if this is really demographically where we have the need and the best bang for our buck. I was sort of basing it on, given some of the loss that we've had in number of group home units, but if there's issues with what's been happening, I think we should know that. I wish I had knew about the issue of where the Justice Department is up front. So, and again, I'll remind staff, if this has anything to do with going to the Justice Department or a federal agency, I shouldn't be associated with it if it goes further.
Okay, are there any other comments? We should go ahead and wrap that up with that guidance. Does that make sense, Mr. Shields, or at least understandable? to
Okay,
you?
we will get answers to the questions, and we'll come back to council, schedule a follow-up work session. And one thing that we will just note that, ultimately, if the decision is to issue an RFP, that is simply to get that is really to get proposals back. And then from there, that you would have proposals then to choose from, and then that's really where the commitment would be made after you get the proposals back. And so there's steps in the process. But I think a key point is that, the public awareness of taking this path, and I think we need to raise the level of awareness so that the council is comfortable that the public understands what we're proposing to do with a public asset.
I think that's correct. Thank you all for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. Why don't we see if there are any council comments before we wrap up this evening? Are there any comments from anyone before we wrap up?
On the schedule.
Yeah.
Just two suggestions. On the Weston Broad, it sounds like it's already been scheduled, but I think those are probably best left as tentative. It's
Yeah, I think
appearing
that's fine.
twice.
Yeah,
It's
that's
appearing on the 19th and the June 22nd work session. And then I think on the downtown area plan, we had a discussion about having a work session to go through the comments before adoption. So if we can schedule that accordingly.
Okay.
Any other comments? Yeah. Mr. Zena,
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to, a couple things. Would like to have a session sometime next week with the city manager and council and planning on split lots. I want to know where you're at, and I'll talk about options.
Appreciate you.
And I would like to have Councilperson Conley attend that session with me. I think she said
You've
she's
got your orders,
generally
Councilman.
available during the day. So if the two of us go, that's great. If we have more, we have to notice it, obviously. Two, we I asked you for all of council here, a bunch of questions on the budget. And so I kind of need to hear back from you when we might expect answers, because I have 17 more questions I want to ask you.
Answer's never then if the
No good deed goes unpunished, but I think you'd rather have this on a steady dialogue than to have 50 of them at budget season.
Well, I thought one of the things we talked about offline was to try to develop essentially a standard deck
Yes.
of budget information that we present year to year. And I'd like to work with the council on that and like to have your suggestions on that.
Okay. So
Now, I don't know if that's immediately pressing. Are you viewing as this is something we want to get done immediately or
well, so we're going to get
before
started on
next
immediately.
March?
Yes. So, I'm thinking that maybe by the end of end of this fiscal year, we could have a lock on what the standard deck might look like. Would that be achievable?
I think that might be achievable.
Okay, that's about to have. So finally, we talked about having some work done on standard conditions and standard proffers. Now, I've seen Arlington's. As I went from page 2 to 17 to 38 to page 56 to page 78, I said I need to buy more paper. So I didn't print it out. But I'm just wondering, it is a lot of work that on both standard proffers and standard conditions. Then part of this would be the built environment. What do we want that to look like? Sidewalks and storefronts, and of course, that's the three legs of the stool. Some of these are harder than others. I don't know how to get to that. Maybe the mayor's got some suggestion. You know me, I'm, big believer in blunt force instruments, so I'd like to give you a timetable, get a draft back to us, or approach at least. Could you come back with an approach in 2 weeks? Would that be too far? Too soon? I mean, we'd hate to have the next developer come along, and we've got one right now with Spectrum.
Well, one thing that's part of the reason I wanted to introduce the subject. Everyone have an answer, but I thought it would be helpful to at least have the discussion and start the ball rolling on that. It sounds like during next week when we have the discussion on the work plan, that would probably be appropriate time for us to give priority guidance to the city manager about what things we want him to be working with staff as a priority item. And so I think your point is well taken, but I might suggest we wait until that meeting to kind of go through our list of things that we came up with at the retreat and try to prioritize them and give guidance as opposed to necessarily doing it
I don't have a problem with that, Mayor, but we have 4 really, really big things to talk about on the 19th.
I hear you, and I don't know, maybe we don't do all those on the 19th, but I feel it's a priority like you do, which is why, because each project that comes in and we don't have standard proffers or conditions and we're reinventing the wheel, we're wasting staff time, we're not getting as good a product as we can. And so that's why I felt a little bit of urgency to it. But I do think Mr. Shields' point is well taken that we are going to come back with the retreat work product and try to sort that out and prioritize things. So I might suggest we wait until that meeting and then give guidance at that time, unless people feel differently. Then that might be my suggestion.
Understand.
Okay. Other comment, Mr. Baruch?
Just on the budget front, Richard, you might want to pay attention. On the budget front, at some point, I think it's going to be important because the next budget season is going to be before us to take a look at the long-term gap projections, especially given the last budget cycle. So I think we're going to need those numbers for the Budget and Finance Committee, and also distributed to council. I know that Richard's already done the work, but it probably needs to be updated given the budget that was passed. And I think that there's some telling projections of what type of revenue growth we would need to see organically in the city to close the gap right now, and they're high on very limited increase in expenditures. So I had a chance to look at a version of the chart that I think all council members did, and it's sobering.
Okay, other comments? Yes. Ms. Conley?
Okay, I have 2 here. One is Mr. Nolan on Lee Street. Has any progress been made in working on people whose lives will be affected by the RPA?
We're going to meet again with Mr. Nolan, but we have not gotten him to where we have not resolved the issue. Yeah.
Are there other neighbors involved in this as well, or is it just him? Or
he's the one that's been in contact with us. But we do want to make sure that the neighbors, that they have any concerns, that we're addressing them. We do have a draft policy, and that policy, as I stated before, we want to run that through the neighbors. We have done that. To date, I think Mr. Nolan is the only one who's voicing objections to that. Let me confirm that.
Okay.
So that we have, when it does come to the council, we have a sense that we're in the right place. This is not just for these neighbors. We hopefully will be daylighting other streams in the future.
Right, so
we
it'd
want
be
this
good
to
to
be
have
a
a
policy that will meet state law requirements and stand the test of time.
Okay. And my My other thing is just to invite everyone in the room here to attend the Falls Church Education Foundation 10th Annual Gala, which is next Friday, May 16th. It's at Washington Golf and Country Club. There are still tickets available, and you can get them at fcedf.org/gala. So, I'll email it to you.
Vice Mayor Snyder and then Mr. Berg.
Right. I'd just like an agenda item at some point on arts funding. We've had repeated requests to up the funding for the arts, and we really didn't address it in this year's budget. So if our surplus ends up being greater than projected, fine. If not, that's okay too. But I want to know I want a session on arts funding. That's it for right now.
Thank you, Mr. Berg.
Who's on the government and finance, or I'm sorry, on the government ops committee?
That's Mary Beth.
Well, Mary Beth already knows about it. I just showed her something that I think best that you all look at.
Hey, while you're doing that, let me just make a brief plug. Gary Laporte, I think, sent this email around, and I thought I would just make it for anyone who happens to be watching still at this hour, the 3 people that are watching at home. But it sounds like Falls Church Police Officer James Brooks and the Police Chief, Chief Gavin, are participating in the 2014 Police Unity Tour, a 250-mile bicycle ride that pays homage to law enforcement officers who've died in the line of duty and honor their sacrifices. And so this is a 3-day ride. It starts May 10th through May 12th. And I would just recommend, to the extent you're able, to go ahead and support them in that worthy endeavor. Thank you. Anyway, anyone else have any other comments?
I'd just like, since the CFO has stayed here this long, for the record to show that the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee said neither the word sobering nor surplus tonight. So trying to strike a middle course there.
All right. Anything else, or Mr. Shields has it announced?
Can I make a quick note? I want the council to be aware that we have been talking with the superintendent of schools about their trailer needs, and they're going to be in a big rush to get funding for it. It's going to be in the neighborhood of about $500,000 to replace the trailers. On their critical path, they need to place the order for these trailers real soon, like in a week, in order to have them delivered and be ready to go by next September. We obviously can't process a budget amendment in a week. And so I've asked her for a formal request, and then when I get it, I'll circulate it to council. But the basic request is going to be for there to be consent that the council is going to consider a budget amendment after they've actually already ordered these trailers. And I'm not looking for any nodding of heads right now, but that's essentially what the schools are going to be asking for, is for permission to proceed, stay on their critical path to meet what I believe is a critical need, and then have the budget amendment come afterwards. So that's one thing I wanted the council to be aware of. And then secondly, on Monday night, we would like to take the opportunity at that meeting to give you a presentation of the city webpage. And so during the manager's report, I'd like to take about 5 minutes to just give, it won't be me, it'll be Susan Finarelli, to give you an advanced look at the new webpage design. And then lastly, on Monday night, Delegate Simmons is planning to come to present the Henderson House proclamation. So he'd be a special guest for us in the Henderson. Ed and Nikki would be at that meeting as well.
Thank you very much. Unless there's any other business, can we have a motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. Abstentions? None. We're adjourned.